Welcome, brave traveller, to Victorian Britain, a place where the air smelled faintly of coal smoke, lavender water, and pure unfiltered judgment. If you're here to understand the etiquette rules that govern Victorian women, buckle yourself into the nearest corset, but not too tightly, we'll get to that later, and prepare for the ultimate cultural obstacle course. Because being a woman in the 19th century wasn't simply about existing, it was about performing a 24/7 character called the ideal lady. A role so demanding that even Broadway actors would say, yeah, I'll pass. Well, hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To get started, imagine being handed a starter pack on your 12th birthday titled Womanhood, Congratulations and Good Luck. Inside, you'd find a pair of gloves for dignity, a fan for communication, a book on posture for suffering, and a thick, leather-bound etiquette manual roughly the size of a horse. Victorian etiquette wasn't guidance. It was a full-time job with no salary, no vacation days, and constant emotional micromanagement. There were rules on how to smile, rules on how to stand, rules on how to breathe, for heaven's sake. And if breathing wrong sounds dramatic, remember, this is the era where doctors believed too much fresh air could ruin your moral character. But let's start with the basics. The Victorian woman was expected to be a glowing beacon of purity, gentleness, self-sacrifice, and general inconvenience. She should look delicate but not sickly, act modest but not dull, and behave obediently but still somehow pleasing. It was like being trapped in an endless job interview for a position you never applied for, judged by people who never blinked. Every movement she made, every word, glance, gesture, or micro-expression was silently measured on an invisible morality scale that seemed to change daily. The era was obsessed with appearances. A woman wasn't simply seen, she was evaluated, usually by people whose own personalities were as stiff as their starched collars. Respectability clung to her like a foggy Victorian mist. If she walked too confidently, she was bold. If she walked too softly, she was timid. If she laughed too loudly, she was unrefined. If she didn't laugh enough, she was unfriendly. If she expressed too much enthusiasm about anything, literature, politics, sandwiches, then society collectively wondered if she needed to calm her feminine nerves. And here is the kicker. These rules only applied to women. Men could stomp around like malfunctioning steam engines, slurp soup like hungry walruses, or sneeze with the force of a freight train, and everyone would say, "Ah, yeah, how distinguished." Meanwhile, if a woman accidentally let her skirt brush the ground too enthusiastically, someone in the room would faint from embarrassment. Etiquette manuals of the time were bestsellers, the self-help books of the Victorian age. Most were written by people who had never experienced joy. They explained how a woman should fold her napkin diagonally because triangles are apparently ladylike, how to angle her head during conversation just enough to appear interested but not enough to appear stupid, and even how to stand near furniture, never lean. Leaning was one step away from moral collapse. These books were filled with terrifyingly specific rules like, a lady should never open her mouth wider than necessary, which sounds less like etiquette and more like an ominous warning before surgery. But what made these rules ridiculous wasn't just the sheer number of them. It was the expectation that women not only follow them flawlessly, but enjoy doing so. The ideal Victorian woman didn't simply obey. She adored obeying. She was like a serene porcelain doll whose factory settings were locked on polite compliance. Any sign of frustration or fatigue was considered a failure of character. Happiness wasn't the goal, endurance was. Victorian society operated like a constantly ticking clockwork machine, with women functioning as the delicate gears expected to run smoothly without making noise. And if any gear squeaked, jammed, or, God forbid, showed an ounce of individuality, the entire neighbourhood would whisper about it for weeks. Did you see Miss Thornbury well? Blinked too often at the luncheon. Absolutely scandalous. A disgrace. Should we pray for her? They rarely had anything meaningful to discuss, so they simply dissected each other's behaviour like amateur detectives in a crime drama where the crime was being slightly human. Daily life was a marathon of silent performance. A woman waking up in the morning had to ask herself, is my posture elegant enough? Is my expression sufficiently mild? Can I make it through breakfast without breathing in a way that suggests I'm enjoying life too much? These weren't exaggerations. This was Tuesday, and beneath all this, pressure. Endless, subtle, exhausting pressure. Victorian etiquette presented itself like a friendly guide to proper behaviour, but it functioned more like a surveillance system powered by gossip, guilt, and the collective terror of social exile. One mistake and your reputation didn't just bruise, it shattered like cheap glass. Yet despite the absurdity, these rules shaped everything. Education, courtship, marriage prospects, social mobility, and even mental health. They dictated not only how a woman behaved, but who she was allowed to become. You couldn't escape them, you could only pray you memorised them, so buckle up. The chapters ahead are your front row ticket to the strange, delicate, suffocating carnival of Victorian womanhood, where etiquette ruled every breath, every glance, every step. And if you ever feel overwhelmed, remember, at least you're just reading about these rules. You didn't actually have to live them. If you think the curtsy is just a polite little dip of the knees, congratulations, you have never encountered the Victorian version, a gesture so over-regulated it might as well have required a building permit. In Victorian Britain, curtsying wasn't simply a greeting. It was a woman's social resume, moral compass, emotional weather forecast and dignity meter, all rolled into one delicate downward movement. Victorian woman couldn't hand someone a business card, but she could perform a curtsy so precise it told you her social class, her upbringing, her confidence level, and how many etiquette manuals her mother had forced her to read before breakfast. Let's begin with the basics. The Victorian curtsy required 3 essential qualities: grace, restraint, and knees that refused to betray you. A proper curtsy was performed with the fluidity of a swan, but the modesty of a librarian trying not to be perceived. Every angle, from the bend of the back to the tilt of the chin, had to be calibrated at like the world's most overdramatic mathematical equation, because heaven forbid a woman's curtsy be too deep, bold, too shallow, cold, too quick, rushed, too slow, flirtatious, too wobbly, untrained, or too enthusiastic, deranged. One wrong angle and suddenly you were the girl who curtsies like a startled goose. Tragic. To execute a flawless curtsy, a woman first had to position her feet. Now, this may sound simple, but nothing, absolutely nothing in Victorian etiquette was simple. Her heels were to be placed together, toes pointed outward at an angle that said, I am elegant, but I also do not have functioning ankles. This stance was crucial. It signalled readiness while also preventing her from accidentally launching herself into the nearest table, which was a surprisingly common concern given the acres of fabric she was wearing. Then came the hands. Oh yes, hands mattered. Victorian women couldn't just let their arms hang like abandoned laundry. Hands were to be lightly clasped in front of the body, fingertips touching, elbows gently rounded. Not stiff, not floppy, not clenched in fear. Softly arranged in a position that silently whispered, I have never had a single troubling thought in my life. Next came the actual descent, the core of the curtsy, the moment that separated the amateurs from the socially endangered. The knees bent outward, never inward. Inward meant you lacked breeding, apparently. And the body lowered in a motion so controlled it bordered on supernatural. The back had to remain straight, not rigid, just a gentle pillar of perfection. A slight bend forward was acceptable, but only slight. Too much lean, and suddenly you looked like you were about to ask someone to pass the salt instead of paying respect. Depth mattered too. A curtsy to a woman of equal social standing required a modest dip, just enough to acknowledge that you recognised her, but not enough to suggest you were auditioning for the role of her most loyal servant. A curtsy to someone of higher status, however, demanded more knee action, but not too much. or you risked giving the impression you were collapsing from admiration or low blood sugar. And then there was the speed. This was vital. Descend too fast and you appeared overeager, like a puppy greeting its owner. Descend too slowly, and it was interpreted as sarcasm or reluctance, a social death sentence. The ideal curtsy moved with the tempo of a sigh, gentle, controlled, and slightly depressing. But here's the secret no etiquette manual admitted. Performing a perfect curtsy in Victorian clothing was a feat requiring Olympic-level balance. Women wore layers of petticoats, heavy skirts, and sometimes hoop structures large enough to host their own weather systems. Tempting a curtsy while wrapped in this architectural marvel was like lowering yourself into a squat while dressed as a portable circus tent. Many women practiced in front of mirrors for hours, terrified that on the day of a social gathering they might wobble and send a ripple effect through the room. Every curtsy held the potential for disaster. One slip, one tremble, and your dress could develop the aerodynamic properties of a sail in the wind. The stakes were high. A curtsy wasn't just movement, it was silent communication. The angle of the head told people whether you were humble or haughty. The softness of your expression told them whether you were agreeable or secretly plotting their demise. The precision of your posture revealed whether you had been schooled properly or were just trying your best to fake it until marriage. And society watched. Oh, they watched. Victorian acquaintances analysed curtsies with the same intensity modern judges reserve for Olympic figure skating. Whisper networks spread commentary like wildfire. Her knees were too far apart. Her descent lacked sincerity. She nearly smiled too much, terribly forward. A single awkward curtsy could follow a girl for months. In a world fueled by gossip, this was the social equivalent of tripping on live television. Young girls were trained from early childhood, drilled repeatedly until curtsying became muscle memory. Families would line up their daughters in drawing rooms, watching them bend and straighten with all the joy of a military drill. Some households took lessons from dancing masters whose entire careers revolved around teaching women how to move like they had no bones. The most maddening part? Men didn't have to do any of this. They got to bow. A simple, dignified tilt of the head. Meanwhile, women risked injuring their ankles just to say hello politely. But despite the absurdity, the curtsy endured. It was a ritual of status, a display of femininity, and a way to navigate social hierarchies without uttering a word. It looked delicate, but behind the scenes it required strength, discipline, and nerves of steel disguised under lace. In the end, the Victorian curtsy wasn't just etiquette. It was performance art, a silent ballet of obedience, a woman's first line of defence in the battlefield of social propriety. Welcome to the fascinating world of Victorian facial etiquette, a world where your own face was considered a hazardous landscape requiring constant supervision, maintenance, and suppression. If you've ever been told to smile more, congratulations. You've barely scratched the surface of what Victorian women had to endure. In this era, smiling wasn't an expression of joy, humour, or basic human emotion. It was a performance, carefully regulated, socially policed, and judged with the intensity of a royal tax audit. Victorian society believed a woman's smile was a public declaration of her moral character, not her education, not her accomplishments, not even her charitable work. No, her smile. And this smile had to exist within a very narrow, suffocating emotional bandwidth. Too wide, improper, too enthusiastic, indecent, too toothy, scandalous, too small, frosty, too long, unhinged, too short cold. Victorian woman's smile needed to say, I am pleasant, but never, under any circumstances, I have emotions. Let's begin with what Victorians feared most. Teeth. A full smile, the kind people give when they're genuinely happy, was considered far too bold. Showing teeth in public was practically an invitation to be judged as frivolous, flirtatious, or emotionally unstable. This was especially ironic given that Victorian dentistry was let's say experimental, and many teeth were doing their best simply to exist. In upper-class circles, smiling too broadly was akin to flashing your personal medical records. Instead, women were instructed to master the closed-lip smile, a subtle upturn of the mouth that conveyed restrained pleasantness, the exact expression someone makes after being handed a cup of tea at a party they didn't want to attend. This gentle smile was prized because it signaled self-control, modesty, and the ability to suppress every natural instinct your face might have. Next came the lesson on duration. The Victorian smile was not to linger. Holding a smile too long suggested desperation, or worse, enthusiasm. Enthusiasm was not a ladylike trait. Victorians feared enthusiastic women the way modern people fear tax audits. A woman who smiled too freely might accidentally give the impression of being approachable or, heaven forbid, interesting. And interesting women were considered dangerous. They might ask questions, they might have opinions, they might exist slightly more loudly than society preferred. Then there was the matter of context. Victorians believed a proper smile should appear only at the appropriate social moment, during polite conversation, upon greeting acquaintances, or while pretending to enjoy someone's painfully lackluster poetry reading. Smiling at strangers in public? Absolutely not. That bordered on indecency. Smiling when a man you weren't related to made a joke? Only if it was a very mild joke. And even then, no teeth. Smiling when someone complimented you? Acceptable. But only if the compliment was modest and your reply was even more modest. The upper classes, in particular, turned smiling into something that resembled a social chess move. It was less an expression and more an encoded message. A small smile at the right moment could signal approval, gratitude, civility. A slightly smaller smile could signal that you were trying to be polite while also spiritually leaving the room. A smile that was too small meant you were bordering on rudeness. And a smile that was too large meant someone would be clutching their pearls before dessert was served. A woman's smile became a tool of self-preservation. Since she wasn't allowed to express displeasure, disagreement, boredom, irritation, or the desire to leave the room and scream into a pillow, she perfected the neutral smile, a facial expression so practiced it could fool even trained observers into thinking she was fine. This was the Victorian woman's emotional armour, an elegant shield of politeness, hiding a turbulent sea of frustration, discomfort, and the quiet wish to run away to a life where she could at least yawn without judgment. Let's not forget photography, which entered widespread use in the mid-19th century and became a nightmare for anyone who wanted to look remotely cheerful. Long exposure times meant subjects had to stay perfectly still for several seconds, and holding a smile that long was seen as unnatural. So instead of smiling, the Victorians adopted the serious expression, which photographers encouraged because it was easier to maintain and looked more refined. Women were told not to grin in photographs because it made them appear unpredictable. Men simply looked grim or proud. Women looked like they had just been told not to breathe too loudly. But smiling wasn't only regulated by society. Etiquette manuals had entire sections dedicated to facial expressions. These guides instructed young women to practice smiling in mirrors to ensure the result looked gentle, effortless, and appropriately modest. One book advised, let the smile be soft, the lips closed, and the effect one of serene sweetness rather than unrestrained mirth. That's right, Victorian etiquette authors were out here giving stage directions like directors coaching actors in a play titled The Death of Joy. The deeper reason behind all this regulation? Control. Victorian society prized female modesty, restraint, and emotional docility. A smile was seen as a doorway to the soul, and society wanted that door firmly locked. A controlled smile gave the illusion that women were calm, agreeable, and content, even when they were exhausted by 1,000 silent rules governing their behaviour. In the end, the Victorian woman's smile wasn't an expression of delight. It was a coded message of compliance. It told everyone around her, I am safe, predictable, and obedient. I will not disrupt the fragile ecosystem of your delicate sensibilities. Her face became a carefully managed landscape. One wrong movement, one overly joyful moment, and suddenly people would question her character. So yes, in the Victorian era, even smiling came with an instruction manual. If you've ever taken a casual stroll, swung your arms a little too enthusiastically, or, heaven forbid, walked at a normal human speed, congratulations, you would have been a full-blown Victorian scandal. In the 9th century, a woman's walk wasn't simply a way of getting from one location to another. It was a performance, an advertisement of her upbringing, a silent resume, a marriage application, and a moral examination, all wrapped into one glacially slow glide across a drawing room. Running was considered scandalous. If a woman moved faster than a mourning turtle, society needed a fainting couch. Victorian etiquette manuals treated walking like a delicate art form. A lady did not walk, she proceeded. She glided. She advanced with modest composure. Anything with momentum or visible leg movement was considered dangerously close to athleticism, and athleticism, to the Victorian mind, lived one street over from unladylike chaos. Let's begin with foot placement, the foundation of a woman's entire reputation. Victorian women were instructed to walk with their feet positioned in a particular way, toes angled outward, heels almost touching, and steps taken from the hips rather than the knees. The goal was to create a smooth, swan-like motion, which sounds lovely until you try doing it while wearing 40 pounds of fabric and shoes so narrow they doubled as foot-shaped medieval torture devices. Etiquette books insisted that women should almost float, meaning no visible bending of the knees. Knees, like most parts of the female body, were considered suspicious. If someone saw your knees move, what next? You might start expressing opinions, so women trained themselves to give the illusion that their lower limbs were carved from polished ivory, graceful, unbending, and entirely ornamental. Next came stride length, another battlefield of judgment. Too long a stride suggested masculine confidence. Too short a stride made you look timid or worse, affected. The perfect Victorian step was somewhere in between, a modest, measured, consistent distance that said, I am making progress, but not enough progress to frighten anyone. Taking large steps was considered vulgar. Taking steps too small could make you appear to be struggling under the weight of your skirt, which was unacceptable because visible discomfort hinted at the scandalous idea that Victorian clothing was impractical. Then there was arm movement, and this is where Victorian etiquette enters its peak comedy era. Arms were expected to hang gently at the sides or be held in front of the body if gloves or a reticule were involved. Swinging the arms, even slightly, was considered coarse. Anything that implied enthusiasm or natural human biomechanics simply wasn't acceptable. Imagine walking without swinging your arms. Now imagine doing that while balancing a parasol, maintaining perfect posture and ensuring your skirt doesn't reveal too much ankle, which, at the time, was considered the equivalent of an R-rated film. Victorian women essentially walked like carefully animated mannequins. Now we come to perhaps the most important element of all, speed. A woman walking too quickly risked being labelled excitable, anxious, unfeminine, or in a hurry, all unforgivable offences. A proper Victorian lady was never in a hurry. Even if the building behind her was on fire, etiquette demanded she leave at a pace suggesting she had merely remembered she left her embroidery unattended. Walking too fast was also considered provocative. It suggested eagerness. It suggested purpose, and nothing terrified Victorian society more than a woman with purpose. So Victorian women were taught to walk at what can only be described as ceremonial speed, slow enough to be modest, steady enough to be dignified, but not so slow that it appeared you were deliberately trying to draw attention. Walking was a negotiation with a world that punished spontaneity. If anyone saw you moving with enthusiasm, rumours flew. She moved briskly, the neighbourhood gossips whispered. Briskly. Yes, I saw it myself, practically darting. darting, my goodness, the nerve. For women of higher social rank, the pressure was worse. In public parks, gardens, and promenades, they were expected to embody elegance itself. A lady who walked with too much bounce was considered unrefined. A lady who walked too stiffly looked unnatural. A lady who tripped, catastrophic. That was the Olympic-level humiliation of Victorian life. Trip once, and you'd spend the next month avoiding eye contact with the entire town. Walking in the city was particularly hazardous. The streets were crowded, unpredictable, and filled with hazards, horses, mud, uneven stones, runaway carriages, vendors who absolutely did not care about your social standing, and occasionally the unpleasant surprise of sewage. A Victorian woman navigating all this while maintaining her graceful glide was doing the equivalent of an acrobatics routine while pretending it was effortless. Even the sound of a woman's walk mattered. Shoes couldn't clack too loudly, it would draw attention. Skirts couldn't rustle aggressively, it would seem impatient. Petticoats shouldn't swish in a way that suggested excitement. Ideally, a woman's walk produced no sound at all, making Victorian promenades eerily quiet and emotionally repressive. Of course, added to all this was the constant fear of lifting one's skirt too high when stepping over obstacles. Victorian clothing designers clearly assumed all roads were perfectly smooth marble. They did not account for reality. Women were expected to lift their skirts just enough not to trip, but not so much that they revealed even a centimetre more ankle than decency allowed. It was a daily gamble between falling face first into the street or committing an act of indecent exposure. And what about running? Oh, absolutely not. Running was forbidden. Running was outrageous. Running was the physical embodiment of impropriety. If a Victorian woman moved faster than a mourning turtle, society needed a fainting couch. Women who ran risked not just judgment, but complete social meltdown. The mere thought of a skirt bouncing too freely in public was enough to make etiquette authors break out in emotional hives. Most absurdly, the physical strain of all these rules often made walking genuinely exhausting. But showing fatigue? Never. Breathing too hard? Unthinkable. A lady might feel like she was silently dying under 8 layers of brocade, but she must appear as serene as a watercolour painting. In the end, Victorian walking was not about mobility, it was about message. A message that said, I have mastered my body, my emotions, and my ability to pretend everything is fine. If you think sitting is simple, something your body does naturally, without requiring moral supervision, then you, my friend, have never encountered Victorian etiquette. In the 19th century, sitting down was less a resting position and more a full-body audition for social acceptance. Every angle, every limb, every tiny shift of weight was choreographed with the same precision as a royal ballet. Victorian women sat like their joints were rented. Let's begin with the approach, because sitting didn't just happen, it required a multi-step procedure. A lady couldn't simply plop herself onto a chair. That sort of barbaric efficiency belonged to men and animals. Instead, she approached her seat slowly, gracefully, as if gliding toward her own doom. She kept her shoulders relaxed, but not too relaxed, her chin slightly lowered, but not submissively lowered, and her eyes forward, never downward. Looking down made it seem like she might actually be considering comfort, which was unacceptable. Once she reached the chair, the real performance began. She positioned herself directly in front of the seat, feet together, and gently reached behind her with one gloved hand to feel the chair's location. This move was tricky because Victorian etiquette demanded she do it without appearing to touch anything. Women were encouraged to behave like furniture simply materialized beneath them at the exact moment of descent. Then came the lowering phase, something modern people call sitting. Victorians, however, treated this as an Olympic sport. A proper lady lowered herself in one smooth, unbroken movement, keeping her back straight, her eyes forward, and her expression as calm as a pond in a watercolour painting. She must not flop, plummet, or descend with any speed suggestive of gravity doing its job. And now, the hard part. Once seated, the woman entered a new realm of restrictions, each more nonsensical than the last. 1. The back, straight but not stiff. A Victorian lady's back had to be as straight as a church steeple but still appear soft. She was expected to sit without leaning, slouching, reclining, or making any meaningful contact with the chair's backrest. The backrest was mostly decorative, a kind of moral support. Actually touching it meant you were lazy or possibly unwell. Leaning back was a silent confession of moral decline. So women learned to hover sitting, the ancient Victorian art of pretending your spine was forged by angels, while your core muscles screamed for help. 2. The hands, a crisis of placement. Where to put your hands? Anywhere except where your body wanted to put them. Hands could rest lightly in the lap, gently clasped, fingers soft, wrists without tension. They could hold a fan or a handkerchief, but only if they did so without fidgeting. They could rest on the armrest only if the armrest was upholstered, if the event was casual, and if no man of higher social standing was watching. Resting elbows on the armrest? Absolutely not. Resting elbows on a table? Sinful. Resting elbows on your own knees? Goodbye social life. Victorian women kept their hands so neatly arranged on their laps that modern observers might assume they'd been glued there. 3. The knees, forever touching, forever judged. Knees were expected to remain together at all times, ideally positioned at a slight angle to create a visually pleasing silhouette. Keeping the knees together prevented any accidental display of ankles, which the Victorians treated like biological weapons of mass distraction. This meant women had to clamp their knees so tightly together that standing up afterward required a moment of recalibration. 4. The ankles, crossed but only in approved directions. Victorian women weren't supposed to cross their legs. That was dangerously close to relaxation. Instead, they crossed their ankles, never the knees, and even this came with rules. The preferred angle was modest, with one ankle tucked behind the other. Crossing ankles too tightly made you look tense. Crossing them too loosely made you appear bold. A gentle, effortless cross was the goal, as if your ankles had simply drifted into place through divine intervention. Any display of wiggling, shifting, stretching, or adjusting was considered unseemly. Heaven help the woman who accidentally showed too much boot. 5. The feet, perfectly placed, quiet at all times. Feet were to be positioned flat on the floor or resting lightly on a small footstool. No tapping, no bouncing, no shifting, no signs of blood circulation. A lady's feet behaved as if they had been politely told to stop existing. If her shirt rustled too loudly when she moved her feet, people noticed, and commented, and judged. Victorian society could hear a woman adjust her foot 1 inch and react like she'd fired a pistol into the ceiling. 6. The dignity endangered. Perhaps the most delicate part of Victorian sitting was the unspoken rule: never reveal discomfort. A woman might be wearing a corset so tight it prevented oxygen from reaching her hopes and dreams. Her skirts might weigh more than a toddler. Her stays might be digging into her ribs like judgmental fingers. The chair might be shaped like a medieval church artifact designed for repentance. But she had to smile calmly and sit as though being in that chair was the pinnacle of joy. Victorian seating was a ritual of self-denial. Women learned to ignore pain the way modern people ignore their email inboxes. Standing up, a graceful emergency. When it was time to rise, she again performed the slow, controlled lift. No hands pushing off, no sudden movements, no sighs of relief. Rising too quickly was attention-seeking. Rising too slowly was suspicious. Rising naturally was impossible. She stood as she had sat, gracefully, silently, and with the full awareness that she was being watched. Victorian sitting wasn't sitting at all. It was static performance art, a test of endurance performed in silk, boning, and societal pressure. Women were expected to defy gravity, ignore pain, and present elegance while battling furniture that actively despised them. Victorian women sat with the poise of swans and the internal suffering of marathons. Their joints weren't just rented, they were on loan, interest accruing daily. Yes, we have finally arrived at the etiquette rule so absurd it feels like satire. Victorian women were taught how to breathe. Not in the medical sense. No one in that era knew what lungs were really up to anyway. But in the moral, decorative, socially approved sense, breathing was not simply a survival function. In the eyes of Victorian society, it was a potential scandal. Deep breathing was basically Victorian twerking. To understand this, we must remember the Victorian obsession with delicacy. A delicate lady was not a woman with good manners. She was a woman who gave the impression she could faint at any moment, preferably onto a chaise longue, ideally in front of someone important. Robust breathing suggested health, vitality, and, horrifyingly, a well-oxygenated rib cage. That last part was considered indecent. Women were expected to breathe lightly, gracefully, and as quietly as the final gasp in a tragic novel. A Victorian woman's breath should never reveal that she possessed lungs, ribs, or any other biological structures that reminded society she was human and not simply an animated painting in a tasteful lace gown. Now, add to this the corset, the ultimate instrument of Victorian self-sculpting. Corsets weren't just tight, they were career-defining. They shaped the waist, lifted the bust, and performed the miracle of squeezing the body into an hourglass even glass would hesitate to form. But corsets were not compatible with breathing. They restricted the diaphragm, repositioned internal organs, and created a chest cavity so small it could barely store a tablespoon of air. Medical experts today might call this concerning. The Victorians called it feminine charm. Women were advised by etiquette manuals, doctors, fashion authorities, and meddling aunts to breathe shallowly. Deep breathing would cause the chest to expand, and chest expansion was considered horrifyingly improper. A heaving bosom was the beating heart of scandal. Imagine being told that the natural rise and fall of your lungs was equivalent to sending a flirtatious invitation to every gentleman in the room. The modesty breath technique. Enter the Victorian modesty breath, the art of taking in the smallest amount of air necessary to remain conscious. Women practiced it the way modern people practice meditation, except Victorian shallow breathing did not aim to reduce stress. It aimed to reduce visibility of the upper torso. The instructions went something like this. Breathe lightly, through the nose only. Do not lift the chest, lift the clavicle very slightly instead. Never sigh. Sighing communicated emotion. Emotion communicated internal life. Internal life was suspicious. If you must catch your breath, do so in a way that suggests you are simply admiring the decor. The result? Many Victorian women floated through life like fragile, lace-covered ghosts, surviving on a level of oxygen that would make a modern fitness instructor call an ambulance. Breathing in public was fraught with danger. A deep breath at a dinner party, indecent. It implied excitement, stimulation, or the worst sin of all, hunger. A deep breath during a walk, suggestive. A rising chest implied internal activity, which implied vitality, which implied liveliness, which implied, well, everything the Victorians feared about women having too much autonomy. A deep breath in front of a man? Social catastrophe. He might think you were trying to attract attention, or worse, that you were planning to have an opinion. Women trained themselves to avoid any inhalation that could be misinterpreted as romantic, enthusiastic, or medically necessary. Shallow breathing caused dizziness, fatigue, fainting, and the inability to deal with stares. These symptoms were bizarrely celebrated. A fainting woman was considered the pinnacle of femininity. Weakness was dainty, fragility was fashionable. Collapsing in public was practically a performance art. Physicians, whose medical degree often consisted of "I have read 2 books and can grow a beard," diagnosed women with hysteria when they fainted. Never once did they consider, perhaps this woman cannot inflate her lungs inside a fabric and whalebone cage. Instead, fainting encouraged more etiquette rules. A feint must be performed gently. A feint must never disturb furniture. A feint must not reveal ankles. A feint must appear spontaneous but not dramatic. Victorian women didn't breathe deeply because deep breathing could disrupt the delicate ecosystem of their social identity. Outdoors breathing was permitted only when managed carefully. Fresh air was considered both medicine and moral danger. Too much fresh air, stimulating; not enough, lethargic. The balance had to be maintained through shallow, controlled inhalations that communicated, "Yes, I am enjoying this air, but I will not let it corrupt me." Indoors, especially in parlours, women were advised to breathe even more delicately because parlours were crowded, parlours were overheated, parlours were where reputations lived and died. Any visible oxygen requirement could be interpreted as nervousness, excitement, or, heaven forbid, sweat. Another minefield: breathing while talking. Women were told to speak softly, slowly, and with minimal lung involvement. A woman who breathed too audibly between sentences was considered uncouth. Drawing breath was a phrase of disapproval, as if refilling your oxygen reserves was a rude interruption to the social ambience. The goal was to speak as though your words floated effortlessly from your throat, powered by air from the spirit realm rather than your own respiratory system. Victorian dances were energetic, twirling, cardio-heavy spectacles for men. For women, they were a slow-motion cardio crisis disguised as elegance. A woman could not pant, gasp, or show signs of exertion, even as her heart attempted parkour inside her ribcage. The ideal dance partner was expected to glide across the floor, smiling softly, while quietly battling the early stages of hypoxia. If she did breathe heavily, well, society whispered, someone enjoyed herself too much. All of this made breathing not just a bodily function, but a battleground. Women were taught to deny their own biological needs in the name of decorum, yet every shallow breath also served as a quiet form of rebellion, a subtle reminder that despite the rules, despite the social policing, despite the corsets compressing their organs like Victorian Tupperware, women still breathed, even if they had to do it quietly, gracefully, and without alarming anyone. Victorian breathing etiquette was the art of survival disguised as modesty. If there is one object that perfectly summarises the Victorian era's relationship with women, it's the corset. Rigid, restrictive, aesthetically pleasing, and completely unconcerned with human biology. The corset was the crown jewel of Victorian fashion and the cruel overseer of women's respiratory systems. The good news? Your waist looked tiny. The bad news? So did your lung capacity. To understand the corset's power, imagine wearing a garment whose sole purpose was to convince the world that your organs were optional. A Victorian woman waking up in the morning didn't simply get dressed. She entered negotiations with anatomy. Tight-lacing wasn't just a fashion choice. It was an entire lifestyle built around compression, compromise, and the constant threat of unconsciousness. Corseting began each morning with a ritual so intense it required teamwork. A woman would stand in her dressing room, arms raised like a mannequin being summoned into existence, while a maid pulled the corset stays tighter and tighter. This was not a one-pull job. This was a sustained, coordinated effort requiring endurance, communication, and several deep breaths, or rather, several shallow, socially acceptable Victorian breaths. The goal? A waist so narrow it made hourglasses jealous. But this was no simple matter of pulling strings until the woman resembled a decorative wine bottle. Corsets had to be tightened gradually, inch by excruciating inch, over months or even years. Some girls began tight-lacing as teenagers, slowly training their skeletons to comply with fashion's demands. This long-term compression could permanently alter ribcage shape. If that sounds alarming, Victorians would politely remind you that beauty requires sacrifice, and if you're still conscious, you're not sacrificing enough. Tight-lacing was the name for pulling a corset to its absolute limit. Today we might call it compression cosplay. The objective was to reduce the natural waistline dramatically. ideally down to measurements that made tailors shake their heads and doctors sigh deeply. Under heavy tight-lacing, the internal organs didn't just shift, they relocated like tenants forced out by a sudden rent increase. Lungs compressed upward, stomach squeezed downward, liver politely moved aside, ribs flattened like decorative latticework. This was celebrated. Women were praised for small waists the way modern people praise high test scores. A dramatic waist wasn't just beautiful, it signalled discipline, refinement, and the ability to ignore physical suffering gracefully, all prime Victorian virtues. Because corsets squeezed the lungs so dramatically, fainting wasn't just possible, it was expected. Victorian fainting couches weren't decorative, they were survival equipment. Corseted women fainted, at balls, at church, at home in carriages, while reading, while standing too long, while sitting too long, while thinking too long. Society considered fainting feminine, delicate, and utterly normal. A woman who fainted frequently was praised for her sensitive constitution. A woman who didn't faint often enough was sometimes considered suspiciously healthy. If a lady did faint in public, there was a correct etiquette for that too. Collapse gently. Do not gasp. Do not fall on anyone. Do not reveal ankles. Preferably faint backward onto furniture, not forward into soup. The feint must always appear elegant, as if the corset hadn't squeezed the entire respiratory system into a decorative postcard. Daily life in a corset required strategic planning. Walking, sitting, standing, talking, climbing stairs. Each task had to be approached with caution. A woman had to choose her movements like someone navigating a minefield. Simple actions became grand challenges. Laughing too hard? Not without risking structural failure. Eating a full meal? Unwise. The stomach needed permission to expand. Turning too quickly? The corset might remind you who's really in charge. Dancing? Manageable, but only if one pretended breathing was optional. Meanwhile, men roamed freely with unclamped organs, unaware of the daily saga unfolding beneath the layers of silk and whalebone beside them. Victorian society demanded women appear serene and composed at all times, even when their ribs were engaged in a polite feud with their lungs. Showing discomfort was unacceptable. A lady must behave as though her corset was perfectly comfortable, like a soft, cuddly hug from an affectionate anaconda. The trick was to move slowly and deliberately, hiding the fact that sitting, bending, or reaching for a teacup felt like participating in a Victorian obstacle course. In public, she must not wheeze, she must not pant, she must not grunt, she must not loosen the laces, she must definitely not acknowledge the corset, she must maintain perfect posture while oxygen levels plummeted. This public composure was one of the greatest illusions of the era. Behind closed doors, however, women sometimes untied their corsets temporarily to breathe like full-sized humans. There are diary entries describing moments of rebellious comfort where loosening the corset was the highlight of an entire week. Doctors of the time were aware that corsets caused dizziness, digestive issues, restricted breathing, displacement of organs, and sometimes fainting fits that lasted minutes. Their solution? Encourage women not to take such deep breaths. Medical authorities wrote long essays on the dangers of overexerting the lungs, as if the lungs had simply become too ambitious. Rather than questioning tight-lacing, society questioned breathing. The corset was both a fashion staple and a symbol of the era's expectations that women should occupy as little physical space as possible. A tiny waist signified modesty, control, restraint. In short, everything Victorian society demanded women embody. But beneath the lace and silk, the boning and the ribbons were women, enduring constant physical pressure while performing elegance with exhausted lungs. The corset may have shaped their figures, but it also shaped the culture. A world where beauty came at the cost of comfort, health, and air itself. In Victorian society, gloves weren't just accessories, they were moral armour, fashion statements, social credentials, and tiny cotton prisons all at once. A Victorian woman's glove said everything about her, her class, her refinement, her intentions, her destination, and whether she'd been properly raised by someone who considered ungloved hands a threat to civilization. A bare female hand was basically the Victorian version of sending someone a saucy emoji. Bold, shocking, slightly scandalous, possibly grounds for a duel. Gloves were expected in nearly every public situation. Morning calls, gloves. Afternoon strolls, gloves. Church, gloves. Visiting acquaintances, gloves. Shopping for more gloves, of course, gloves. A woman without gloves in public was as unthinkable as someone strolling down the street today without pants. It simply was not done unless you wanted neighbours to whisper about what questionable activities you'd been up to with your unprotected fingers. Wearing gloves, however, wasn't as simple as slipping them on and going about your day. No, this was Victorian etiquette, meaning even your fingertips required supervision. There were strict rules about glove materials, glove lengths, glove colours, and glove situations. Thin kid leather gloves were considered the pinnacle of elegance, soft enough to show refinement, expensive enough to show status, and delicate enough to ruin at the slightest hint of moisture, which conveniently meant you'd need to buy more, a delight for glove makers and a financial catastrophe for everyone else. One of the most important rules was when to remove them. Women were expected to keep their gloves on during almost all social interactions. You could shake hands with gloves on. You could converse with gloves on. You could sip tea with gloves on, though this required the dexterity of a magician and the balance of a tightrope walker. But certain moments required the removal of gloves, and these moments were like social landmines. Remove them too soon, and you appeared immodest. Remove them too late, and you seemed unrefined. Remove them in the wrong room, and congratulations, you were now the subject of 9 separate gossip circles. Gloves absolutely had to be removed before eating. Victorian etiquette considered touching food with gloved hands so offensive it practically violated the laws of nature. Imagine someone trying to eat a biscuit with gloves on. Victorian onlookers would have fainted from moral shock, but you couldn't just yank them off like a normal human. No, glove removal required slow, delicate peeling, fingertip by fingertip, in a dainty gesture that suggested elegance rather than impatience. Tossing gloves onto a table was forbidden. They had to be placed neatly on your lap or beside your plate, folded like tiny fabric swans with impeccable manners. Woe betide the woman who removed the wrong glove at the wrong time. Removing your right glove when you meant to shake hands with a superior could imply you were too familiar. Removing both gloves too quickly could imply eagerness, a terrible trait for a Victorian woman, who was expected to show the same emotional temperature as a marble statue. And exposing both hands? A level of boldness that bordered on romantic solicitation. Men might quietly lose their minds. The handshake had its own rules. Men removed their gloves to shake hands with women. Women, however, usually kept theirs on, unless the encounter was especially intimate or familial. A man touching a woman's bare hand was a subtle thrill, a tiny, electrifying moment permitted only by etiquette's rare loopholes. Victorian literature is full of trembling descriptions of gloved hands brushing, or bare fingertips meeting, because for people trapped under 10,000 layers of rules, this was their emotional equivalent of skydiving. Even the way a woman moved her hands while wearing gloves carried meaning. A gloved hand could discreetly conceal emotions. A slight adjustment of the wrist could communicate boredom. A tiny flick of a fan held in a gloved hand could signal interest. A gloved fingertip lightly touching fabric could show admiration for something. In a world where speaking freely was discouraged, gloves became their own silent language, a polite Morse code for the emotionally repressed. And of course, gloves had to match the occasion. Long gloves for evening events, short gloves for morning outings, white gloves for formal affairs, coloured gloves for fashion-forward ventures, dark gloves for mourning. And then there was the glove emergency. What to do when gloves got dirty? A lady could not, under any circumstances, be seen with unclean gloves. Dirty gloves suggested a dirty life, and Victorian society loved nothing more than judging a woman's entire moral value based on the state of her fingertips. That meant women often carried multiple pairs of gloves, tucked into reticules, tiny purses designed to hold nothing except perhaps a single glove, a stray coin, and anxieties about social failure. If a glove tore, stained or wrinkled, it triggered immediate panic. Some women even carried glove stretchers, tiny instruments designed to keep gloves perfectly shaped. Imagine living in a world where even your glove maintenance had rules. The greatest irony: gloves made almost everything more difficult. Pouring tea, turning pages, writing letters, picking up coins, threading needles, and even gripping doorknobs became small tests of patience. But difficulty wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Victorian etiquette thrived on making life complicated enough to prove you belonged in polite society. If something required skill, suffering, or suppressed discomfort, then it was probably considered ladylike. In the end, gloves were more than fabric. They were a symbol of Victorian womanhood, polished on the outside, constricted on the inside, always performing, never fully free. They concealed imperfections, projected refinement, and created distance between a woman and the world. They were elegant barriers, soft shields, and socially mandated disguises. If anything, Victorian glove etiquette proves that in a society obsessed with controlling women, even the smallest part of the body, a hand, was considered too powerful to be revealed. If you've ever been told to lower your voice, you've experienced a tiny droplet of what Victorian women lived under every day. In this era, a woman's voice wasn't just a tool for communication, it was a potentially dangerous force that had to be carefully monitored, moderated, minimised, and ideally, rarely deployed. A Victorian woman could be seen. She could be admired. She could even occasionally express an opinion if the moon was in the right phase. But heaven forbid she be heard. Her voice could be heard, but only at frequencies usually reserved for ghosts. The first rule was volume. A Victorian woman's voice should hover delicately just above silence. Not quite a whisper. Whispers suggested secrets, and secrets suggested impropriety, but definitely not conversational volume. A lady was expected to speak in a tone so airy, so soft, so muted that guests often had to lean in uncomfortably close just to catch a syllable. And that was the point. The effort required to hear her proved she was refined. Her thoughts were offered like rare gems, faint and exclusive, accessible only to those with excellent ears or excessive free time. Anything above this gentle murmur was considered coarse. Loudness, laughter, or even audible enthusiasm could stain a woman's reputation faster than a spilled pot of afternoon tea. If a woman accidentally raised her voice to express excitement, surprise, or, the worst offence, frustration, the entire room would freeze as if she'd just confessed to robbing a bank. Men were allowed to boom, bark, shout, and proclaim like foghorns wearing waistcoats. Women, they were expected to communicate as though each word weighed a fortune and volume taxes were severe. Tone mattered too. Tone was a moral indicator. A woman's voice had to be smooth, even, and gentle, expressed with the kind of restrained calm one usually associates with librarians or small woodland creatures. Sharpness or sarcasm was absolutely forbidden. Wit was possible only if soft, subtle, and perfectly non-threatening. A woman could be clever, but only in a way that didn't disturb anyone's fragile Victorian sensibilities. Anything too sharp, too bold, too pointed, that veered dangerously close to having a personality. Then there were the acceptable topics, a tidy, suffocating little box into which women were expected to shove all their conversational contributions. Suitable topics included the weather, but only if it wasn't dramatic, flowers, but not in a scientific way, home decor, nothing too avant-garde, recent social visits, only the polite kind, light charity work, nothing too gritty, and compliments. Women were expected to braid every conversation with polite acknowledgement of others' accomplishments, outfits, gardens, children, or general existence. Forbidden topics? Oh, that list was far longer. Politics were absolutely off-limits, unless the woman wanted to instantly gain the reputation of being spirited, unwomanly, or prone to intellectual overstimulation. Current events, especially anything involving conflict, were considered too harsh for female conversation. Money was crude, science was dangerous, personal opinions about social issues were reckless. Medical matters were scandalous, and bodily functions, those were stored in a taboo vault locked so tightly it didn't open again until the 21st century. Even discussing books was perilous. Women were allowed to talk about novels, the gentle, moral ones, but not philosophy, history, or anything that hinted at education beyond decorative needlework. Showing too much intellectual curiosity was like waving a lit match inside a Victorian powder room. It wasn't illegal, but people would panic. Victorian women learned to navigate this verbal minefield with a mix of caution and quiet endurance. They developed the special skill of speaking just to fill silence while simultaneously saying absolutely nothing. A truly accomplished Victorian woman could spend an entire hour talking without expressing a single emotion, opinion, or fact. It was a kind of conversational magic trick, the ability to speak without leaving any evidence behind. The restrictions on content came with restrictions on frequency as well. Women should not speak too often, too long, or too eagerly. Dominating a conversation was considered grotesque. Interrupting was a moral failure. Speaking assertively was a tragedy. And arguing, completely out of the question. A Victorian woman who disagreed openly with someone, especially a man, risked shredding her own social standing. A disagreement had to be phrased softly, indirectly, and with enough apology woven through it to make the listener forget she'd said anything at all. Even laughter came with rules. Women could laugh, but delicately, so light, restrained sound. More breath than joy. Anything resembling a hearty laugh was considered wild and ungoverned. A laugh that carried across the room could end an entire season's worth of social invitations. Yet perhaps the strangest rule of all was that a woman's voice was never supposed to reveal her inner life. Emotion had to be ironed out, flattened into polite neutrality. Excitement sounded childish. Frustration sounded unbalanced. Passion sounded dangerous. A lady's voice should be pleasant, controlled, and pleasantly hollow, a decorative sound rather than a functional one. The irony was that some women weaponized this softness. The ability to speak quietly forced everyone else to lean in. In a world where women had very little social power, controlling how others physically moved toward you was almost a hidden advantage. But even this small leverage had to be wielded carefully, because if someone felt a woman was consciously manipulating attention, she became calculating, which was merely Victorian code for she thinks too much. The result of all these rules was a generation of women who developed subtlety into an art form. Their conversations were like lace, intricate, delicate, impossibly fine, and utterly designed to hide anything meaningful beneath layers of social embroidery. And that was the Victorian conversation ideal, a symphony of soft sounds, polite emptiness, and carefully measured breaths, all wrapped in the constant fear that one wrong word might send your social standing plummeting down a flight of silk-covered stairs. Of all the strange and spectacular rules Victorian women lived under, nothing captures the era's anxious, pearl-clutching imagination quite like its restrictions on language. Victorian society didn't just police how women behaved, it policed the very words that came out of their mouths. A woman's vocabulary had to be delicate, sanitized, morally uplifting, and, ideally, entirely disconnected from the physical realities of human existence. Victorians treated the word leg like it was a swear word, which made discussing furniture incredibly awkward. To understand how extreme these linguistic constraints were, picture a world where entire categories of language simply vanished for women. Anything remotely biological? Forbidden. Anything describing the body? Too suggestive. Anything acknowledging that humans were creatures with limbs and organs? Absolutely scandalous. A woman was expected to speak in soft, floral metaphors that floated gently above reality like a lace parasol. Concrete words were coarse, literal words were dangerous, and anatomical words, A moral catastrophe. Take the word leg, for instance, a seemingly harmless body part. Yet Victorians believed it was too intimate for polite conversation, as if merely acknowledging the lower limb might trigger an outbreak of indecency. Women could not say it. They could not hint at it. They could not refer to the part of the body responsible for walking because, shockingly, walking involved movement, which involved muscles, which involved physicality, which was obviously a slippery slope into societal collapse. So they resorted to euphemisms like limb, or the delightful lower extremity, which made everyday conversation sound like someone reading from a medical textbook with stage fright. This awkward avoidance led to some spectacular linguistic acrobatics. A woman could not say she bumped her leg. She injured her limb. A woman could not say she crossed her legs. She adjusted her posture. And in the greatest display of Victorian discomfort, women discussing a table leg had to call it a support. Imagine furniture shopping in this era. Excuse me, does this fine mahogany side table have sturdy supports? Ah, yes, madam, the supports are quite strong. The whole exchange sounds like two spies exchanging coded messages, but the real minefield awaited in biological vocabulary. The word pregnant, for example, never crossed the lips of a respectable woman. It was considered vulgar, explicitly tied to the undeniable fact that at some point, brace yourself, reproduction had occurred. Instead, women used euphemisms such as in a delicate condition, in the family way, or the astonishingly vague expecting. Expecting what? A child, of course, but the Victorians preferred to pretend the entire miracle of life simply happened off-screen, behind a tasteful curtain, without ever acknowledging the mechanics involved. Even the word underwear was considered inappropriate. Underclothes, unmentionables, or personal linens were the preferred terms, as if speaking the word underwear might summon impropriety like a Victorian version of Voldemort. Women buying new garments had to navigate conversation like defusing a social bomb. "I am looking for items worn beneath one's attire," they might whisper to shopkeepers, who were somehow supposed to interpret this with flawless accuracy. It's a wonder Victorian shops didn't have an entire section labelled "Things we're all pretending don't exist," and it didn't stop there. Words describing bodily functions, erased. Words hinting at anatomy, forbidden. Words that might imply physical needs, weaknesses, or anything suggesting that women's bodies did more than float gracefully through parlours. Absolutely not. A respectable Victorian woman didn't sweat. She glowed. She didn't use the bathroom. She retired briefly. She didn't feel unwell. She was indisposed. And she certainly didn't have her period. She suffered from monthly troubles, a visitor, or, in the most poetic evasion, nature's adjustment. These linguistic rules did more than shape conversation. They shaped identity. Women were trained to speak as though their bodies were fragile illusions. The absence of realistic vocabulary created an absence of realistic self-understanding. If you cannot say a thing, you eventually learn not to think it. Victorian society wanted women's speech and women's inner lives to remain tidy, ornamental, and stripped of messy humanity. This censorship didn't just protect public modesty, it reinforced social control. Men could discuss biology, medical issues, politics, and bodily functions freely. Women were expected to stay in the realm of the delicate, the domestic, and the harmless. The limitations on vocabulary were limitations on power. If a woman couldn't speak openly about her body, she couldn't complain about her health. If she couldn't use precise words, she couldn't challenge precise injustices. If she couldn't discuss facts, she couldn't enter factual conversations. Language was the leash that kept women in their designated sphere. Even humour had to be carefully managed. A joke with even a hint of physicality or innuendo could mark a woman as bold, and bold was Victorian code for morally questionable. This forced women to master the art of implication, creating a whole separate comedic dialect that danced around meaning like a polite waltz, instead of saying anything directly. The result? Witty women existed, but their wit came wrapped in layers of lace, euphemism, and plausible deniability. Still, some women found ways to subtly bend the rules. Some used double meanings, some used irony, some inserted gentle rebellions into letters or diaries. But in public, the vocabulary rules held firm. Speech was a costume, a performance, another layer of etiquette draped over daily life. If Victorian women sounded delicate, it's because they were forced to swallow every strong word, every blunt truth, every inconvenient fact, and replace it with soft, fuzzy substitutes designed to keep society from having a collective meltdown. Words were trimmed, softened, disguised. Entire topics became linguistic phantoms. The result was a beautifully curated silence, where language seemed elegant but felt suffocating. Victorian vocabulary etiquette wasn't just about what women couldn't say, it was about who they weren't allowed to be. In the Victorian era, eating wasn't a simple biological necessity, it was a high-stakes social performance in which one wrong bite could sabotage your entire reputation. Victorian etiquette was less enjoy your meal and more perform delicate dental origami. A woman didn't merely eat. She interacted with food as though it were a dangerous creature that needed to be subdued with grace, precision, and minimal visible chewing. If the meal fought back, well, she was expected to lose politely. The rules began long before a bite ever reached her lips. The moment a Victorian woman sat at the dinner table, she entered a silent battlefield governed by her fork, knife, posture, expression, and the unspoken threat of social catastrophe. Her fork had to be held at a specific angle, not too steep, which suggested clumsiness, and not too horizontal, which suggested greed. The fork was almost always held downward, in the continental style, because flipping it over to shovel food risked giving the impression that she ate like a hungry person. Hunger itself was considered deeply unfeminine. A lady's appetite was meant to be spiritual and aesthetic, not dictated by the unreasonable demands of her stomach. Bite size was another delicate minefield. Each bite needed to be small enough to disappear neatly behind closed lips, but not so small that she appeared anxious or childish. The perfect Victorian bite was about the size of a modern breath mint, modest, tasteful, and designed to require the faintest possible movement of the jaw. A woman who took bites that were too large risked being seen as undignified. A woman who took bites that were too tiny risked looking affected or overly precious. The message was clear. A Victorian lady should consume just enough food to stay alive, but not enough to suggest she enjoyed staying alive. Once the food entered her mouth, the real challenge began: chewing. A Victorian woman was expected to chew invisibly, lips closed, teeth hidden, jaw movement minimal, and, crucially, no sound. Even the softest chewing noise was considered an assault on the delicate auditory fabric of polite society. If someone heard you crunch, the evening was ruined. Women practiced this art with an almost monastic discipline. They learned to position food on the back of the tongue, angle it away from the cheek to avoid noticeable mastication, and time their chewing to coincide with background sounds, clinking glasses, rustling skirts, dramatic pauses in tedious storytelling. Chewing was like breathing, necessary but deeply frowned upon if any evidence escaped into the visible world. Even swallowing had rules. It had to be subtle, quick, and never accompanied by visible throat movement. A swallow that was too prominent risked drawing attention to the neck, which, in Victorian logic, was practically anatomical promiscuity. A proper swallow was nearly invisible, the sort of gesture that appeared to happen through polite sorcery rather than human anatomy. Then there was the matter of expression. Victorian women were forbidden from showing any reaction to the food. Delight was too enthusiastic. Disgust was impolite. Surprise, perhaps from encountering an unexpected spice or an unidentifiable Victorian sauce, was unthinkable. A lady's face had to remain neutral, serene, and thoroughly unbothered. Even if the soup tasted like boiled wallpaper paste, she had to endure it with a faint, tranquil smile that said, "I am above earthly concerns. including flavour. Handling potentially messy foods introduced fresh terrors. Soup, for example, was an entire etiquette chapter by itself. A Victorian woman had to scoop away from herself, sip from the side of the spoon, avoid slurping, avoid dripping, avoid inhaling too obviously, and absolutely never blow on hot soup. If it was too hot, she waited, and waited, and waited. Because patience was ladylike, even when steam was actively trying to melt her eyebrows. The bread roll, innocent as it might seem, was the source of agony. Bread was not to be bitten into directly. That was barbaric. It must be delicately torn into tiny, respectable portions, buttered one minuscule piece at a time, and consumed with the gentle dignity of someone feeding grapes to a deity. Anything more enthusiastic than this was considered a sign of questionable upbringing. Fruits had their own rules. Grapes, destem and eat individually. Oranges, peel with a knife, never fingers. Apples, slice them. Pears, slice them. Anything round enough to bite directly was sliced within an inch of its life. The Victorians looked at fruit and asked, how can we remove everything natural about this? Fish was a catastrophe waiting to happen. You had to remove bones quietly, elegantly, without making a face and without poking around to reveal uncertainty, and without indicating that the fish itself was full of architectural hazards. If a small bone accidentally landed in your mouth, you had to remove it discreetly with the fork, place it on the edge of the plate, and pretend nothing had happened. If the bone attempted to murder you, which fish bones often do, you had to choke politely, without coughing or alarming the table. Dying would have been considered rude. And what about talking? Women had to avoid speaking while chewing, of course, but they were also expected to avoid speaking too soon after swallowing, just in case any trace of movement might remain. Timing a pleasant conversational comment became a puzzle requiring split-second accuracy and impeccable lung control. Then there was the final and most terrifying rule of all: never ever appear hungry. A Victorian woman could eat, but she could not need food. Needing food was earthy, animalistic, undignified. She should appear as if food was an optional indulgence she partook in only because her host had gone to so much trouble preparing it. The ideal Victorian woman floated through meals like an elegant hummingbird, touching food lightly, tasting politely, and consuming almost nothing while appearing perfectly satisfied. In the end, Victorian eating etiquette wasn't about nourishment. It was about performance, self-denial, and proving that even at the dinner table, a woman's primary goal was to take up as little space, noise, appetite, and existence as possible. If any single ritual defined Victorian Britain, it was tea drinking, a practice so sacred, so elaborately choreographed, so wildly over-regulated that it made religious ceremonies look casual. Tea wasn't just a beverage. It was a moral test, a social performance, and an anxiety-inducing minefield of a potential faux pas. One loud slurp and congratulations, you are now the talk of the town, and not in a good way. A Victorian woman approached tea the way modern people approach diffusing a bomb, slowly, carefully, and with the chilling awareness that one mistake could ruin everything. The first rule began with the teacup itself. Picking it up was an art. Your fingers could not claw around the handle like a barbarian grasping a mug. No, the thumb and index finger delicately held the top of the handle, while the middle finger supported the bottom. The other two fingers, utterly useless in this situation, were expected to curve inward in a gentle, ornamental pose. Too limp, and you look sloppy. Too rigid, and you look tense. The perfect Victorian teacup grip suggested that you were born with porcelain in your hand and expectations on your shoulders. Then came the matter of raising the cup. You couldn't lift it too fast, eager, too slow, melodramatic, or too high, aggressive. The ideal cup elevation was smooth and controlled, as though guided by invisible strings pulled by a tasteful deity. And contrary to modern myth, the pinky was absolutely not to be extended. Pinky raising was seen as pretentious, the Victorian equivalent of announcing, "Behold my superiority. No proper woman would dare." Once the cup was at the correct position, precisely mid-chest level, the next challenge began: sipping. Sipping tea in the Victorian era required the coordination of muscle groups normally never called upon during beverage consumption. A woman could not be caught opening her mouth too wide. That was how chaos happened. She had to open her lips just enough to allow the smallest possible flow of tea to enter, ideally without producing even the whisper of a sound. A silent sip was the gold standard. A soft sip was tolerable. Anything louder than a butterfly flapping its wings was a catastrophic breach of etiquette. One slurp, your social ranking plunged faster than a dropped biscuit. 2 slurps, you might as well have punched the hostess. 3 slurps, you would need to relocate, possibly to another country. Then there were rules about breathing while drinking tea. The Victorians seemed perpetually disturbed by the women showing signs of human physiology. A woman could not inhale too deeply before sipping. That implied anticipation, which implied enthusiasm, which was dangerously close to having a personality. She also could not exhale audibly afterward. An appreciative sigh after a warm sip of tea would sound almost indecent. Tea drinking required breath control worthy of opera training. Ideally, no one should be sure you were actually breathing at all. The next challenge was avoiding clinking. Clinking was the enemy. A teacup touching a saucer with any audible sound suggested recklessness or emotional instability. Placing the cup back on the saucer had to be done with surgeon-level precision. Women practiced this motion in their bedrooms, lowering the cup millimetre by millimetre until it made no sound whatsoever. The cup had to settle silently, like a tiny, fragile spacecraft touching down on velvet. But the minefield didn't stop there. Victorian etiquette dictated that you never look into your cup while drinking. That showed insecurity. You also couldn't stare over the rim at your companions like a hawk. That suggested predatory intentions. The correct gaze, softly downward, but not at the cup. Gently unfocused, but not vacant. Refined, but not smug. Tea drinking was essentially facial ballet. Then there was conversation. A woman was expected to gracefully interweave chatting with tea sipping, but never at the wrong moment. Speaking with a cup halfway to your lips was vulgar. Speaking immediately after swallowing risked revealing a tiny motion in the throat. Scandalous. Speaking too long without sipping suggested that you were not enjoying the tea, which insulted the hostess. Every sentence had to be timed with the precision of a clockmaker adjusting gears. Handling sugar introduced new dangers. Victorian sugar tongs were tiny metal instruments designed by someone who clearly wanted women to fail publicly. A woman had to pick up a sugar cube with the tongs in a single attempt, no fumbling. If the cube dropped even slightly, even quietly, even if no one saw except the house cat, word would spread. People would know. The sugar cube incident would become legend. Stirring tea was another ordeal. You could not stir aggressively. That might create clinking. You could not stir lazily. That might imply boredom. You could not stir in circles. That appeared childish. You were expected to move the spoon back and forth gently, silently, and only 2 or 3 times. Any more and you seemed anxious. You were also not allowed to leave the spoon in the cup. That was the height of impropriety. The spoon had to be placed neatly on the saucer, angled just so, its handle pointing politely toward 5 o'clock. Accidents, of course, were unforgivable. If a woman spilled tea, even a droplet, she had to pretend it didn't happen, while simultaneously dying internally. If she stained the tablecloth, she had committed a social crime. If she stained her dress, she had committed a personal tragedy. And if she stained someone else's dress, well, that was how rivalries began. In the end, Victorian tea etiquette wasn't about tea at all. It was about discipline, self-control, and the expectation that women should navigate their lives with the precision of a glass figurine balancing on the head of a pin. Tea, theoretically a comforting drink, became a test, a performance designed to demonstrate that a woman could be gentle, restrained, elegant, and entirely unthreatening even while consuming something as innocent as hot water infused with leaves. Of all the absurd injustices Victorian women endured, none is quite as tragically comedic as the Great Pocket discrimination. Men got pockets, Women got us tiny bags that held nothing but regrets. And thus began one of the quietest, pettiest battles in fashion history. A conflict fought not with weapons, but with the total absence of them, because women had nowhere to store anything except resentment. In the Victorian era, pockets were considered far too practical for women. Practicality suggested independence. Independence suggested mobility. Mobility suggested freedom. And freedom? That was one plot twist Victorian society had no interest in entertaining. Men could stride about with pockets full of coins, keys, pens, pocket knives, notebooks, handkerchiefs, snacks, spare snacks, and probably an entire rolled-up map of the British Empire. Women, meanwhile, were expected to drift through the world carrying nothing heavier than a moral warning. The logic was simple and also ridiculous. A woman whose clothing had functioning pockets might carry things, meaningful things, useful things, secret things, and society simply could not trust women with the power of cargo space. So instead of pockets sewn into dresses, which had been normal centuries before, Victorian fashion pivoted toward the reticule, a dainty, decorative, utterly useless drawstring bag that was basically the fashionable equivalent of an apology letter. A reticule could hold exactly 3 items: a handkerchief, a coin for emergencies, and despair. Anything else was considered excessive. If a woman attempted to fit anything more substantial inside and say a folded letter, or a compact sewing kit, or a sandwich, because Victorian lunches were basically a myth, the delicate silk fabric stretched ominously as if warning her, you dare defy Victorian expectations? Because the reticule was small and fragile, it demanded etiquette of its own. A woman couldn't just swing it casually by the drawstring, that suggested recklessness. She couldn't clutch it tightly, that suggested anxiety. She had to hold it lightly, dangling from a gloved wrist like the world's tiniest hostage. The reticule was meant to be decorative first, functional second, and emotionally burdensome always. Worse still, the reticule wasn't optional. Leaving the house without one suggested carelessness, but relying on it? That suggested poor planning. A reticule was a paradox, a trap, a polite little curse disguised in embroidery. It announced to the world, I am refined enough to carry a fashionable accessory, but restricted enough that I cannot carry much else, including autonomy. What could a woman carry in her reticule? Only items deemed feminine, modest, and socially appropriate. Acceptable objects included a handkerchief for gentile weeping, a vinaigrette for fainting emergencies, calling cards for social visits, a tiny coin purse for the smallest financial decisions, and perhaps a lace-wrapped smelling salt. Anything remotely practical, small knife, a notebook, a pen, a key to something meaningful, even a modest piece of food, was frowned upon. The Victorian world seemed deeply afraid that if given the space, women might store thoughts, ambitions, or worse, snacks. Keys were a particularly contested item. A woman with too many keys looked suspiciously independent. She might be responsible for managing property, opening locked drawers, or having private belongings. Such implications were scandalous. Men, meanwhile, jingled around like mobile hardware stores with no one batting an eye. The absence of pockets affected everything. If a woman needed money, she had to rely on someone else to carry it or hide a coin beneath her glove. If she needed a personal item, she couldn't tuck it safely away. She had to keep it in her reticule, available for anyone to glimpse. Privacy was not only discouraged, it was structurally impossible. A pocket would have allowed secrecy. Secrecy allowed autonomy. Autonomy frightened everyone. Even the clothing itself conspired against women. Skirts were massive, layered and heavy. Ironically, there was more than enough fabric real estate to house entire storage compartments, but instead of adding pockets, fashion designers stuffed them with crinolines, bustles, and decorative nonsense. Women floated through rooms like walking sculptures of fabric, but heaven forbid they carry a coin without alerting everyone in a 3-meter radius. What makes the pocket scandal even more tragic, or darkly comedic, is that earlier generations did have pockets. In the 18th century, women tied large pockets under their skirts, accessible through slits in the fabric. These pockets were roomy enough to carry tools, money, letters, and personal items. Essentially, women had the Victorian version of cargo shorts, hidden, practical, deeply unappreciated. But by the 9th century, fashion began demanding silhouettes so sleek and exaggerated that pockets became inappropriate. The absence of pockets was marketed under the guise of elegance, but its real purpose was control. If you control what a woman can carry, you control where she can go, what she can do, and how independently she can live. And if she happens to faint from hunger because she couldn't carry a snack, well, fainting was considered feminine anyway. Even when pockets did appear, usually in aprons or house dresses, they were reserved for domestic labour. Household pockets were for carrying keys, sewing tools, or kitchen necessities, all reinforcing a woman's role inside the home. Public pockets were dangerous. Private pockets were inappropriate. Only servant pockets served practical functions, and even those were tightly monitored. A Victorian woman wishing for pockets was not just wishing for storage. She was wishing for freedom, privacy, practicality, mobility, and independence. Pockets represented possibility. Reticules represented containment. By the end of the century, some women began openly criticising the absurdity of pocketless clothing. Suffragettes even adopted pockets symbolically. They sewed them into their skirts as signs of empowerment. And what did they put in them? Pamphlets, letters, money, keys, ideas, everything they weren't supposed to carry. Victorian pockets tell a story much bigger than fabric themselves. They reveal how society managed and restricted women's daily lives down to the smallest, most mundane details. The pocket was power. Its absence was control. Victorian Britain was a land of rain, clouds, fog, and emotional repression. So naturally, even umbrellas and parasols came with their own suffocating set of etiquette rules. A Victorian woman couldn't simply protect herself from the elements. Oh no, she had to shield herself with dignity, modesty, precision, and enough finesse to avoid accidentally sending messages of flirtation, defiance, or mild enthusiasm. Tilting your parasol the wrong way, suddenly you're accidentally proposing marriage. Parasols and umbrellas serve dramatically different social purposes. Parasols, delicate and sunny, existed purely for beauty. Umbrellas, sturdy and damp, existed for survival. Parasols said, "My complexion is more important than my comfort." Umbrellas said, "I am resigned to the weather, but will pretend I'm not." Women were expected to know the difference instinctively, or risk becoming the topic of whispers among people who had nothing better to do. The first rule was how to hold the thing. A parasol was not meant to be gripped like a utilitarian tool. It was held lightly, elegantly, like a fragile bird perched on the hand. Fingers curved gently around the handle, wrist soft, elbow slightly bent. Not too bent, aggressive, not too straight, robotic, but at just the right angle to suggest that one's entire existence was a watercolour painting. Walking with a parasol required fluid, graceful movements, as if the woman were drifting gently through life, completely unbothered by wind, insects, or the reality that the parasol blocked approximately 3% of sunlight. Umbrellas, on the other hand, were heavier, clunkier, and far more dangerous. Victorian etiquette guides spent an alarming amount of time warning women not to behave like violent automatons when handling umbrellas. Opening an umbrella had to be done with slow, controlled delicacy. A sudden snap open was considered the height of rudeness, not to mention a genuine threat to nearby hats, hair, and small dogs. An umbrella popping open with too much enthusiasm might knock someone's bonnet off, and knocking off a stranger's bonnet was practically a diplomatic incident. Once opened, the umbrella had to be positioned carefully. Too high and you appeared pretentious. Too low and you risked decapitating someone's feathered hat. The ideal umbrella height allowed rain protection, while ensuring the woman could still see where she was going, which was important because Victorian streets were full of hazards. puddles deep enough to drown in, horse droppings, runaway carts, grumpy geese, and men who believed women shouldn't be outside anyway. Parasols, unlike umbrellas, came with a whole extra layer of subtext, because shading oneself from the sun was considered an art with perilous flirtatious possibilities. A parasol tilted slightly forward suggested modesty. Tilted backward, it suggested confidence. Tilted to the side, well, that was where things got tricky. A parasol angled too dramatically could be interpreted as sending secret signals, especially in public gardens or promenades where idle gentlemen watched nearby. Victorians believed parasols could communicate through angles alone, a silent semaphore of romance, and so a woman walking through a park with her parasol tilted just a bit too charmingly could accidentally ignite gossip about a presumed courtship with a man she had never met. Even carrying a closed parasol had rules. It had to be held vertically, never horizontally, too aggressive. It couldn't drag on the ground, too careless. It couldn't swing, too playful. Ideally, it rested lightly by the woman's side, the way a knight might carry a sword if swords were delicate sticks wrapped in silk and lace. Opening or closing a parasol required absolute elegance, no shaking, no flicking, no struggling with the latch in a way that revealed frustration or upper body strength. If the mechanism jammed, which parasols were notoriously prone to do, a woman had to maintain a serene expression while gently coaxing it open, all while pretending she wasn't on the brink of tearing it apart with rage. Losing your temper with a parasol was seen as a moral failure. During windy weather, parasols became torment. A gust of wind could flip one inside out with the force of a divine prank. But a woman could not wrestle with her parasol like a fisherman battling a marlin. That was unladylike. She had to hold her ground, keep her composure, and gently coax the parasol back into position. Meanwhile, men were allowed to swear at umbrellas that betrayed them. A woman was expected to smile through the betrayal, even as the wind attempted to turn her parasol into a metal frame projectile. Umbrellas, too, had strict rules for rainy days. Sharing one with a man? Scandalous unless you were married, related, or engaged. Two people beneath one umbrella created an intimacy bubble society found deeply suspicious. A man and woman walking together under an umbrella might as well have been writing their wedding announcement. Worse yet, the umbrella could dip or tilt in ways that brought heads closer, brushing shoulders or cheeks, an impropriety so potent it could spark rumours that would outlive the participants. Then there was the etiquette of passing other pedestrians. Victorian streets were narrow and umbrellas were wide, so navigational etiquette became a bizarre negotiation exercise. A woman had to lift her umbrella slightly while passing shorter individuals and lower it slightly when passing taller ones, all while maintaining control and avoiding collision. Two umbrellas bumping was practically a social scandal, and if her umbrella brushed against a man's, oh, the gossip that would follow. Finally, the etiquette of storing umbrellas indoors added complications. A woman had to shake off raindrops discreetly, never aggressively, and place the umbrella in a stand without dripping water everywhere. Dripping was unrefined. Dripping suggested haste. Haste suggested chaos. Chaos suggested a woman who could not maintain dominance over her weather accessories. In the end, umbrella and parasol etiquette revealed another truth about Victorian life. Even the weather, unpredictable, uncontrollable, utterly indifferent to human rules, had to be confronted with poise. Women were expected to conquer the elements with ladylike restraint, turning every practical necessity into a polished performance. Rain, sun, wind, whatever nature threw at them, they were required to handle it with grace, dignity, and zero spontaneity. If Victorian etiquette had a single unbreakable commandment, it was this: thou shalt never be comfortable. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rules governing posture. Victorian posture had one motto: if you are comfortable, you're doing it wrong. A woman's spine wasn't just an anatomical structure. It was a public performance piece. Standing, sitting, walking, Waiting, every second of a Victorian woman's vertical existence was monitored with the intensity of someone inspecting priceless crystal for hairline cracks. Let's begin with the spine. A Victorian woman's spine was expected to be straight, not naturally straight, but unnaturally, almost theatrically straight. Her back had to form a vertical line so perfect it could have been used as a plumb rule by architects. No curving, no slouching, no natural human relaxation. If her upper back dared to round even slightly, etiquette experts would materialise from the ether to gasp in horror. A lady should appear as though she had swallowed a yardstick and was actively trying to keep it from falling over. Shoulders were equally policed. They had to be gently back, only gently, because anything too far back would make her look militant, and anything too far forward would make her look like she had emotions. The ideal Victorian shoulder position conveyed serenity, purity, and just a hint of martyrdom. Women spent years training themselves to maintain the precise angle of shoulder rotation that communicated, "I am lovely, composed, and definitely not experiencing discomfort or existential dread." The chin had its own rules. A lady could not tilt her chin too high, that was haughty. She could not tilt it too low, that was sullen. The chin had to hover at an angle that suggested modest confidence, soft awareness, and a complete absence of self-assertion. A Victorian woman's chin was essentially the traffic light of her personality. One wrong angle and she sent the wrong message entirely. Then there were the arms. They were never to dangle freely like those of ordinary humans. Arm placement required intention. When standing, arms rested lightly at the sides, elbows close but not glued, wrists soft but not floppy. Any movement that looked natural was prohibited. A woman with swinging arms appeared athletic, and athleticism implied strength. And strength implied independence. And independence was, of course, a threat to society itself. Even hands had posture expectations. They needed to look delicate, purposeful, and incapable of violence or meaningful labour. Fingers remained slightly curved, as though holding an invisible flower. A lady with stiff fingers looked anxious. A lady with loose fingers looked bold. And a lady with hands on her hips, scandal incarnate. Hands on hips suggested attitude, and Victorian etiquette existed to prevent women from having anything resembling that. Nowhere were posture rules more extreme than in the back. Women were trained, sometimes from childhood, to avoid leaning. Leaning was a sin against elegance. Leaning against walls suggested sloppiness. Leaning against furniture suggested laziness. Leaning on tables suggested mental collapse. Leaning on one leg more than the other, even subtly, threw off the sacred geometry of Victorian silhouette. A woman was supposed to distribute her weight evenly on both feet, as though the earth would tilt off its axis if she dared favour one side. This meant standing for long periods was a test of endurance. Women stood at social events for hours, maintaining perfect posture while engaging in polite conversation, pretending that the corset wasn't chewing their ribs like an angry badger. While men lounged comfortably in chairs or casually leaned against mantelpieces, women became upright sculptures of endurance. They didn't just stand, they ascended into a posture realm beyond mortal comfort. Posture also had an emotional purpose. A woman's upright stance was supposed to demonstrate self-control, modesty, and inner tranquility. A slouch implied laziness. A slump implied sorrow, which implied instability, which implied gossip. A woman who leaned forward too much appeared nosy. A woman who leaned backward appeared disengaged. A woman who leaned sideways appeared, well, unbalanced. The safest option was to avoid leaning altogether and simply stand like a living, breathing chess piece. Walking posture had its own set of expectations. The neck was kept elongated, the chest slightly lifted but never expanded because expanded chests were dangerously close to breathing incorrectly, and the shoulders stayed quiet. No bouncing, no rolling, no hint that she was using muscles to move her body forward. The ideal Victorian gait suggested gliding, floating, sliding gently over the earth without ever truly touching it. Women became experts at suppressing the natural mechanics of locomotion to create the illusion of frictionless movement. Even posture while standing still had nuance. If waiting for someone, a lady could not cross her arms, hostile, clasp her hands tightly, nervous, or fiddle with anything, childish. She stood with gentle poise, a serene statue of polite anticipation radiating the message, I have complete self-control, and my joints will never, ever betray me. And of course, posture applied outdoors as well. Victorian women were expected to withstand weather conditions, wind, rain, humidity, questionable urban breezes, without altering their posture. A gust of wind might blow a parasol into orbit, but her spine, unmoved. A sudden downpour might collapse the hairstyle she spent 3 hours constructing, but her shoulders, still aligned like they were drawn with a ruler. The tragedy, or comedy, depending on perspective, is that posture was never just posture. It was a morality test. Straight backs meant straight values. Strong posture meant strong character. Slouching meant weakness. Leaning meant impropriety. The Victorian woman's entire reputation lived somewhere between her shoulder blades. By the end of the era, some women began quietly rebelling. Feminists criticised posture standards, noting that corsets, etiquette, and rigid expectations were turning women into ornamental objects. But for most of the century, posture was destiny. It determined how a woman was seen, judged, interpreted, and valued. Victorian posture wasn't about beauty, it was about control. Every vertebra was a battleground, every shoulder angle a performance, every stance a declaration of disciplined femininity. Comfort was sacrificed for image, mobility for delicacy, and individuality for rigidity. Women didn't just stand or so. They upheld the entire architecture of Victorian respectability with their spines. If Victorian etiquette had a personality, it would be that overbearing relative who insists on supervising your every move for your own good. Nowhere was this more suffocating or absurd than in the rules governing a woman's interactions with men. Your independence level was set to goldfish. Victorian society treated women as delicate, fluttery creatures incapable of surviving a single unaccompanied moment without causing scandal, fainting inappropriately, or eloping with the nearest mustachioed stranger. The human chaperone system was not a guideline. It was a lifestyle. The rule was brutally simple. A respectable woman was never to be seen alone with a man who was not a family member, fiancé, or medically necessary emergency personnel. Even then, society might raise an eyebrow. Women were expected to drift through public life like satellites permanently tethered to a gravitational body, usually a mother, aunt, governess, or, in dire circumstances, a reliable family friend who possessed approximately the charisma of boiled cabbage. The presence of a chaperone was proof that a woman was being watched, managed, and prevented from doing anything as dangerous as making her own choices. Being unaccompanied was practically a social crime. If a woman walked down a street alone, even at a perfectly respectable pace and in broad daylight, people wouldn't wonder where she was going. They'd wonder what she was doing, what she was thinking, whether she was planning something. A lone woman could ignite more gossip than a political scandal. Mothers warned daughters that going unaccompanied transformed them instantly into public women, a Victorian term so ominous it implied a moral collapse severe enough to trigger community prayer. The chaperone system extended to nearly every social setting. Visiting a gentleman's house, you needed a chaperone. Receiving a gentleman in your own home, chaperone. Sitting in a garden where a gentleman might appear within 300 metres, you guessed it, chaperone. Even at large social gatherings like balls, women weren't truly free. They might momentarily step away to fan themselves or sip lemonade, but the room's unofficial network of mothers, aunts, and observant dowagers tracked every movement like hawks monitoring prey. Privacy was impossible. So was spontaneity. Greeting men came with its own intricate rules. A woman could not simply wave, nod, or, heaven forbid, initiate enthusiastic friendliness. She had to wait for the man to bow or acknowledge her first. If he did, she offered a small, polite inclination of the head, a gesture so tiny it risked going unnoticed entirely. Anything more expressive might suggest familiarity. Anything less suggested rudeness. Women lived in the narrow limbo between too warm and too cold, always adjusting their greetings as though calibrating a very sensitive Victorian thermometer. Shaking hands was even more complicated. A respectable woman never extended her hand first. She waited for the man to do so. If she deemed him worthy of a handshake, and if her gloves were appropriate for the occasion, she offered a gentle gloved hand with zero pressure. A firm handshake was a vulgar display of strength which hinted at independence, which hinted at dangerous things like decision-making. Her handshake needed to feel like a polite suggestion, not a greeting. Conversation with men required cautious choreography. A woman was permitted to exchange pleasantries, weather, travel conditions, light compliments, but anything beyond surface-level chat risked appearing bold. She could not speak to a man for too long, too intently or too privately. Privacy in Victorian mathematics equaled temptation, and temptation equaled moral downfall. Sometimes a woman could be mid-sentence, only to have her chaperone appear like a well-trained ghost to escort her elsewhere, which really meant rescue her from accidentally displaying personality. The most sinister part of the human chaperone system was how deeply it tied a woman's respectability to surveillance. A woman under supervision was considered trustworthy, not because she was trustworthy, but because someone was nearby to ensure she behaved like the decorative creature society expected her to be. The chaperone's mere presence was like a notarized signature of propriety. Without that presence, everything a woman did, where she walked, whom she greeted, which shops she entered, could be twisted into scandalous interpretation. Men, naturally, faced none of this. A man could wander the city alone for hours, engage in boisterous conversation, visit taverns, attend meetings, and interact with people freely. His unsupervised identity was viewed as normal. Women's unsupervised identities were viewed as concerning. The double standard was so blatant it would be hilarious if it weren't tragic. The chaperone didn't just guard against impropriety, she guarded against rumours, and Victorian rumours were feral beasts that bred like rabbits. A 5-minute conversation with a man could turn into an understanding by dinner, secret courtship by breakfast, and impending scandal by lunchtime. Society never needed facts, needed only the faintest scent of impropriety. Thus, the chaperone's job wasn't to prevent misbehaviour, it was to prevent misinterpretation. Even the most mundane situations could spark panic. Imagine a woman drops a handkerchief. A man politely retrieves it. Unchaperoned? That small act could become a full-blown romantic saga retold across the neighbourhood with breathless exaggeration. Now picture that woman accompanied by her aunt. The same handkerchief exchange becomes harmless. Not because anything is different, but because someone was there to witness, supervise and declare it was entirely proper. Women quickly learned to live within this suffocating system, mastering the art of appearing calm, graceful, and unbothered while moving through life like someone on a very short leash. Some women accepted it as the natural order. Others found small ways to rebel, slipping out briefly, trusting a sibling to cover for them, or cleverly using a servant as a decoy chaperone. But such acts carried risk, and the consequences of failure were socially catastrophic. The human chaperone system wasn't just about supervision. It was about control. It taught women that independence was dangerous, solitude was suspicious, and autonomy was something that needed to be protected from them, not for them. It wasn't that Victorian society didn't trust women, it was that they didn't want women to trust themselves. In the Victorian world, letter writing wasn't just correspondence, it was performance art. A woman didn't simply put words on paper. She constructed a delicate, lace-trimmed, emotionless hologram of herself, presented through handwriting, oh precise and content, so sanitized that her personality had to squeeze itself into the margins like an apologetic footnote. Your letter needed to be beautifully scripted and emotionally empty, much like a Victorian marital relationship. Everything about a woman's letter, from ink colour to sentence structure, was governed by etiquette as rigid as her posture. First came the handwriting itself. A lady's script had to be flawless, looping, elegant, gently slanted, and impossibly consistent. A shaky line hinted at nerves, a sharp angle hinted at forcefulness. Too large, childish, too small, stingy, too quick, impulsive, too slow, overly dramatic. The ideal handwriting had a rhythm, calm, measured strokes that suggested a life free of passion, fatigue, or the desire to scream into a pillow. Women practiced handwriting obsessively. Etiquette books advised hours of daily repetition to achieve curves worthy of admiration. Not that anyone cared about what she said, and men could fill pages with sloppy chicken scratch and still be taken seriously, but a woman's handwriting was seen as a window into her soul. If the script was refined, she was refined. If it was imperfect, society assumed she was spiritually lopsided. Ink colour came next. Black ink was respectable. Blue ink was acceptable. Anything more expressive, outrageous. A lady using coloured ink flirted dangerously with creativity. Some even dared to use violet ink, a scandal so subtle it could keep gossip circles fed for days. Red ink was absolutely forbidden. It was associated with bookkeeping, assertiveness, or, worst of all, emotion. A lady's words should never appear too bold, even visually. Margins were another battleground. A woman's letter needed generous margins on all sides, not because she needed the space, but because the empty borders symbolized modesty. Filling the page completely made her look overeager or intellectual, both undesirable traits. A lady should appear to have so little to say that she barely occupied the page. Leaving half the paper blank told the recipient, "I am respectable, controlled, and definitely not a person who expresses opinions." Then there was the content. A woman could write about pleasant days, family updates, safe social topics, vague sentiments, and seasonal greetings. Nothing too intense, nothing too honest, nothing that hinted at frustration, ambition, or wanting something beyond the day's embroidery assignment. A lady's letter was a verbal parlour room, tidy, airless, and decorated with polite thoughts no one would dare trip over. Forbidden topics included anything political, scientific, philosophical, medical, bodily, passionate, humorous in the wrong way, critical of society, critical of men, or reflective of deep self-awareness. If it made someone think too much, it was unacceptable. Women were warned that strong opinions on paper could damage their reputation, which was Victorian code for make men uncomfortable. Emotional expression was heavily regulated. You could express mild affection, gentle gratitude, or restrained sympathy. Anything stronger needed to be metaphorized into oblivion. Missing someone became thinking of your presence with fond remembrance. Anger became feeling slightly unsettled by the recent events. Devastation became being a bit low in spirits. Despair became finding it difficult to maintain my usual cheer. The safest emotional tone was the literary equivalent of lukewarm tea, pleasant, mild, and incapable of offending anyone. Love letters. Those were an acrobatic nightmare. A woman expressing love had to do so through veiled phrases, soft sentiments, and strategically placed compliments. Passion was unacceptable. Longing was dangerous. Romantic enthusiasm could be interpreted as boldness, and boldness as moral decay. A Victorian woman in love had to write as though she were almost but not entirely thinking about the man. Her words had to hover like polite ghosts around the subject without ever touching it directly. And heaven forbid she write anything that implied desire. Desire was a word that lived in Victorian shadows. The closest acceptable sentiment was something like, "I look forward to our next meeting with pleasant anticipation, which is what you might write to your accountant today. Women also had to consider timing. Sending a letter too quickly after receiving one made her seem overeager. Waiting too long made her seem rude. The perfect interval depended on the recipient's status, gender, and relationship, calculated with the same precision as an astronomer plotting lunar cycles. Even folding the paper was an etiquette sermon. Creases had to be straight and neat. No crooked folds, no uneven corners. A poorly folded letter suggested internal chaos. If sealed with wax, the height of elegance, the emblem had to be perfectly centred, applied with careful pressure, and absolutely never in a colour implying drama like deep red. Pale colours were safest, pastel wax for pastel emotions. Addressing envelopes required restraint as well. Women could not write a man's first name unless he was family, engaged, or married to her. Using both first and last name, too intimate. Using titles too casually, disrespectful. Using titles too formally, aloof. Victorian letter addressing was essentially a puzzle where every incorrect answer ruined your life, and finally the signature, no flamboyance, no flourish. A simple yours truly, yours respectfully, or with warm regards, not too warm, was safest. Anything else risked implying personal feeling. By the time a Victorian woman finished writing a letter, she had performed a moral balancing act, an emotional diet, a linguistic contortion, and an artistic labour, all to produce a message that conveyed absolutely nothing except her ability to follow rules. Victorian letter writing wasn't communication, it was containment. Women's personalities were flattened, pruned, and pressed like botanical specimens onto paper. Their words were allowed, but their voices were not. In Victorian Britain, visiting wasn't the wholesome, friendly drop-in we imagine today. It wasn't popping by for a pleasant chat, nor was it an innocent excuse to escape the house for a few hours. No, visiting was war. Social calls were combat missions executed with gloves, bonnets, time limits, coded rituals, and the ominous knowledge that one wrong move and the neighbourhood grapevine turned into a flamethrower. Everything about a visit, how long you stayed, what you wore, what you said, how you entered, how you exited, how you touched your teacup while you were there, became evidence for or against your respectability. Let's start with the time limits, which were stricter than Victorian morality itself. A proper social call lasted exactly 15 minutes. 15, not 10, which meant you were cold and dismissive, not 20, which meant you were clingy and lacked self-awareness. 15 minutes was the magical duration that allowed you to display interest without appearing desperate for companionship. A woman had to keep one eye on the clock and the other on her own posture, all while maintaining small talk so gauzy and delicate it practically floated off the furniture. The moment she arrived, the first thing she did was hand over her calling card, a tiny rectangular symbol of identity, reputation, and terrifying implications. Calling cards weren't merely introductions, they were social currency. A beautifully printed calling card announced refinement, a sloppy one announced chaos. Handing it to the wrong servant meant it might never reach the hostess. Leaving a card unreturned was the Victorian equivalent of a slap. And if a woman folded the corner of her card, a secret code signalling a personal visit, she risked sparking gossip equivalent to romantic fireworks. Outfit requirements added another layer of madness. A woman had to dress appropriately for the hour, the season, the neighbourhood, the weather, and the mood of the universe. Morning calls required outfits that were elegant but not glamorous. Too much lace suggested you were trying too hard. Afternoon calls required slightly finer fabrics, but nothing too bright. Bright colours suggested frivolity, and Victorian society feared frivolity almost as much as it feared ankles. And heaven forbid she wore the wrong hat. A bonnet too large swallowed her face. A bonnet too small revealed her forehead, which inexplicably was considered too bold. Everything had to be balanced like an elaborate fashion equation where one miscalculation led to scandal. Once inside the home, a woman entered the battlefield of acceptable topics. Polite conversation was limited to weather that wasn't too extreme, health that wasn't too specific, and compliments that weren't too enthusiastic. Family updates were fine as long as they avoided illnesses, childbirth, money troubles, or anything that hinted at real human experience. Discussing politics marked her as dangerously opinionated. Discussing literature risked making her appear too educated. Discussing the hostess's decor was safe, unless she accidentally implied taste. And asking personal questions was absolutely forbidden. Victorian visiting was essentially talking while saying nothing, smiling while meaning nothing, and staying upright while feeling nothing. Of course, this entire ritual was judged mercilessly. A woman's performance as a visitor determined how the hostess and her entire circle would classify her personality. Did she sit down too quickly? Impatient? Did she sit too slowly? Affected? Was she too quiet, dull, too talkative, overbearing? Did she sip her tea too soon? Greedy? Did she wait too long, uncomfortable? Was her voice too soft, weak, too strong, aggressive? A woman visiting someone's home was essentially offering herself up for moral inspection, and the inspection was thorough. Even her entrance mattered. A proper entrance involved stepping into the room with calm grace, offering a subtle bow of the head, and waiting, absolutely waiting for the hostess to indicate where she should sit. Choosing your own seat was rebellious, maybe even deranged. Sitting on a chair meant for someone of higher rank was social suicide. Too close to the hostess meant you thought you were equals. Too far meant you didn't care. Entire friendships were derailed because someone sat on the wrong piece of furniture. The exit was just as fraught. A woman had to rise smoothly, no sighs, gather her belongings gracefully, no fumbling, thank the hostess elegantly, no flourishes, and leave the room with quiet dignity, no quick movements. Exiting too fast implied she was bored. Exiting too slowly implied she wanted something. Exiting at the wrong moment could block servants entering the room, which guaranteed scandal because Victorian households believed servants existed only when summoned by name, not before. Then there was the nightmare scenario, arriving at someone's house only to be told the hostess was not at home. This phrase didn't actually mean she wasn't home. Often she was sitting right inside, sipping tea, refusing to see you. Not at home was Victorian code for, "You're not worthy of entry today." Women learned to smile, nod, leave their calling card, and pretend this wasn't a devastating blow to their ego. Sometimes hostesses used this line to send subtle messages. "You visited too often," "Your dress was too loud last time," or "Your last remark about my curtain still haunts me." Even the frequency of visits had rules. Visiting too rarely suggested aloofness. Visiting too often suggested desperation. Visiting unannounced meant you had absolutely no respect for anyone's schedule, morality, or interior decorating. Everything had to be calculated, orchestrated, and performed. The final layer, the most terrifying layer, was the post-visit gossip circuit. Whatever happened during a social call did not stay in the home. It travelled. It flew. It went from neighbour to neighbour with supernatural speed. Did you see her dress? Did you hear what she said? Did you notice how long she stayed? Did she drink too much tea? Did she blink suspiciously during the conversation? One whispered remark could become a full-blown narrative by dinner. By morning, that narrative had mutated. By the next afternoon, it was a social legend. Visiting wasn't just communication, it was performance, diplomacy, emotional balancing and silent battle, all held together by perfectly timed smiles and perfectly controlled small talk. Victorian visiting wasn't hospitality, it was survival. If Victorian etiquette had a favourite sport, it was over-analysing acts of kindness until they became social liabilities. Nowhere was this more painfully obvious than in the rules about gift-giving. A Victorian woman could not simply hand someone a present and walk away feeling generous. No, every object she offered carried layers of hidden meaning, moral implications, emotional symbolism, and the terrifying potential to start a scandal. Give a man a handkerchief and boom, wedding rumours. Victorian society believed that small objects could reveal huge intentions. Women, already expected to communicate through delicate gestures, rather than direct statements, were immediately suspected of romantic motives whenever they offered anything of value. And value didn't mean expensive, it meant personal. A handkerchief, a simple square of fabric, was considered intensely intimate. Giving one to a gentleman suggested fondness. Embroidering one for him suggested devotion. And if you gave him one with your initials, social Armageddon. People would talk, people lived to talk. The handkerchief incident could appear in newspapers disguised as local interest. Jewellery, of course, was the nuclear option. Jewellery wasn't just personal, it was practically a romantic confession wearing gemstones. A woman giving jewellery to a man implied the relationship was far more than friendship. Even exchanging jewellery among female friends carried emotional symbolism that needed to be tiptoed around. But if a woman gave jewellery to a man she wasn't married to or engaged to, society assumed two things immediately. They were secretly courting, and the wedding was happening next week. Victorian etiquette books warned young women never to give a man anything he could physically wear that included brooches, pins, gloves, watch chains, or, heaven forbid, a scarf. A scarf wrapped around a man's neck was practically your arms wrapped around him. The implications were too intense. One wrongly gifted scarf and a man might consider himself the protagonist of a dramatic romance novel. Even books, an otherwise innocent gift, required caution. A book containing poetry? Absolutely forbidden unless the giver intended emotional chaos. A book containing political writing? Too bold. A book containing history? Too masculine. A book containing religious text? Acceptable. But only if the writing inside used the stiffest, least emotional handwriting known to woman. Otherwise, one poetic flourish and the gentleman's mother might begin knitting a wedding coat. Then there was art. A woman giving a man a drawing or painting she had made herself was like handing him a piece of her soul wrapped in moral panic. Even an innocuous sketch of flowers could be interpreted as flirtation. The mere act of giving something handmade suggested emotional investment, talent, and time, all dangerous indicators of romantic intent. If a woman painted something specifically for a man, well, she might as well start practicing her wedding curtsy. Food gifting was also fraught with peril. If a woman baked something for a man, the assumptions were immediate and unavoidable. Baking required effort, skill, and domestic warmth. Presenting homemade treats to a gentleman meant you were demonstrating your suitability as a wife. A single tin of biscuits could create a chain reaction that ended with a visit from his family, just to see what kind of girl he was apparently associating with. Fruit baskets were safer, but only barely. Fruit symbolised abundance, prosperity, nature. All things Victorians enjoyed turning into metaphors about your reproductive future. Giving someone fruit was fine. Giving someone fruit with a handwritten note? Scandal. Money, in any form, was completely off limits. A woman giving money to a man was considered degrading, not to him, but to herself. It suggested she was bold, uncontrolled, or attempting to buy affection. All horrifying prospects. Even lending money was taboo unless the man was closely related. Victorian women were taught that financial involvement with men was the first step toward moral ruin, as though coins themselves carried corrupting forces. Stationery, oddly enough, was one of the few acceptable gifts, as long as it wasn't personalised. A plain notebook said, "I am polite." A notebook with embossed initials said, "I want your heart, sir." 1 inch of gold trim could be the difference between a courteous gesture and a marriage proposal occurring fully against your will. Even flowers, the safest, most socially sterilised gift imaginable, came with warnings. The Victorians loved assigning meanings to flowers, creating a blooming dictionary of emotional codes. But this meant a woman could accidentally propose, insult, flirt, reject, or imply deep longing simply by choosing the wrong petals. A rose might be seen as romantic. A red rose, practically a confession of eternal devotion. A white rose, symbol of purity, but also quiet affection. A yellow rose, friendship, unless the recipient decided it meant jealousy. Victorians found drama in botany the way modern people find drama in group chats. So what could a Victorian woman safely give? Very little. Lacework was acceptable if it was impersonal and not sized for anyone specific. Small trinkets meant for general display could be offered without causing emotional riots. Gadgets or tools were deemed masculine and therefore too forward. Anything too practical suggested she knew how to live independently, which was not the image Victorian society wanted women to project. The safest gifts were things that had no purpose. Paperweights shaped like spheres, tiny decorative fans that barely moved air, miniature watercolour landscapes purchased from shops rather than painted at home, little objects that did nothing except exist. These were perfect because they carried no personal attachment, no symbolism, no intimacy, just aesthetic neutrality. And yet, despite how constrictive all these rules were, women navigated them with remarkable creativity. Some learned to gift items in pairs, one for the gentleman, one for his mother, which cleverly diluted the meaning. Others sent gifts through intermediaries, so the object couldn't be interpreted as a direct gesture. A few daring souls even used the forbidden items intentionally, sending handkerchiefs or small personal tokens to men they actually wished to attract romantically. Weapons of flirtation deployed with strategic recklessness. But for most women, gift-giving in the Victorian era was an emotional tightrope. Too impersonal and you seemed cold. Too personal and you accidentally became engaged. Even generosity could be dangerous when your reputation was constantly being measured, weighed, and publicly discussed like a highly anticipated theatrical premiere. In the end, Victorian gift etiquette reveals the sheer absurdity of a society where intention didn't matter. Interpretation did. A woman's every gesture was decoded, judged, and potentially exaggerated into a lifetime of consequences. Gifts weren't just objects. They were messages, statements, promises, traps. In the Victorian era, grief wasn't just a personal emotion. It was a full-time dress code regulated with the precision of military protocol and the creativity of a stage costume department. Victorian grieving wasn't about healing. It was about showing the world your wardrobe was emotionally damaged. A woman's sorrow had to be visible, measurable, colour-coded, and performed with such exhausting dedication that the actual emotional part sometimes felt secondary. Grief became fashion, and fashion became a public obligation. Let's begin with the tyrant of the mourning world, Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died, she plunged into mourning so deeply and so dramatically that the entire nation followed her into a 40-year wardrobe identity crisis. Victoria essentially declared that sadness was the new black, and literally, and black clothing became the uniform of moral suffering. It didn't matter if you were a widow or the cousin of someone whose neighbour had died. Mourning culture trickled down like a very dark waterfall. Widows, however, bore the strictest rules of all. A Victorian widow had to wear mourning clothes for years, not months, not seasons, but years, because apparently grief had an expiration date only society could declare. The first stage was deep mourning, which lasted for a full year and a day. Why the extra day? Because Victorians loved dramatic precision. During deep mourning, widows wore nothing but matte black. Black dresses, black rumble veils, black collars, black gloves, black parasols, even black handkerchiefs. The only thing not black was the crushing exhaustion underneath it all. This fabric couldn't be shiny or fancy. No silk, no satin, no sheen. If your dress reflected even a whisper of light, people would gasp, "Has she moved on?" Deep mourning fabric had to be so dull, it absorbed every ray of hope and sunlight within a 3-foot radius. Crepe was the favourite material. A stiff, scratchy, misery-textured fabric, specially designed to look funereal and feel terrible. Wearing crepe was like being wrapped in emotional sandpaper. Then there was the infamous widow's weeping veil, a long black veil so thick it made it difficult to see, breathe, or walk without tripping dramatically over one's own sense of loss. Widows were expected to wear it outdoors as a visual curtain of grief. If anyone could see their face, it meant they weren't grieving hard enough. Women walked through town like ghostly monuments of despair, half blind and entirely judged. After deep mourning came second mourning, where things got slightly less bleak, emphasis on slightly. Widows were finally allowed to replace the misery sandpaper crepe with softer fabrics and reveal small hints of shape and texture, but everything was still black. Jewellery remained forbidden. Anything shiny remained forbidden. Anything joyful remained forbidden. But at least the veil shortened, allowing the widow to navigate a staircase without spiritual assistance. Next came the mysterious world of half-mournings, the Victorian version of emotional, soft launch back into normal life. Half-mourning allowed the reintroduction of muted colours: grey, mauve, lavender, dusty lilac, shades so subdued they made storm clouds look cheerful. These colours signalled, I am still devastated, but now I can see shapes again. Half-mourning lasted several months, sometimes up to a year, depending on your relationship with the deceased and how determined society was to keep you looking romantically unavailable. And speaking of romance, mourning etiquette for widows included strict social restrictions. During deep mourning, widows were expected to avoid parties, gatherings, concerts, theatres, dances, dinners, and anything resembling joy or community. Leisure activities were forbidden, laughter was banned, and socialising was suspicious. A widow who smiled too soon was practically committing emotional treason. The only acceptable hobbies were crying, needlework, journaling sadly, and thinking about loss with dramatic subtlety. Even during half-mourning, women had to re-enter society with extreme caution. They could attend small teas or modest visits, but definitely not anything with orchestra, music, dancing, or, heaven forbid, eligible bachelors. A widow was supposed to avoid attracting attention. After all, nothing said impropriety like a grieving woman being noticed. Daughters and close female relatives followed their own strict mourning calendar, though not as long as widows. They too wore black, transitioned through half-mourning and avoided lively activities. Mourning wasn't just personal grief, it was a family uniform that announced, "We are currently in emotional exile, do not attempt friendliness." The fascinating or deeply frustrating part is that men's mourning expectations were practically non-existent. A man could throw on a black armband, literally a strip of fabric the size of a napkin, and be done with it. While women carried the emotional burden in the form of crepe armour, men carried a decorative sleeve stripe. The asymmetry was so absurd it bordered on satire, and yet society accepted it as completely normal. The symbolism of mourning clothes mattered immensely. Everything a woman wore signalled where she was in the grief timeline, and whether it was socially appropriate for people to approach her, invite her somewhere, or discuss her future. If her dress was too light, too soon, she was insensitive. If it was too dark for too long, she was melodramatic. If she misjudged the correct moment to introduce lavender, chaos ensued. And then there was mourning jewellery, oddly allowed, but only of a certain kind. Widows could wear jewellery made of jet, a deep black fossilised wood. It was lightweight, fragile and expensive, the perfect metaphor for Victorian femininity. Some even wore mourning lockets containing hair from the deceased, a practice that modern people often find creepy, but Victorians considered deeply sentimental. The important part was that the jewellery had to be non-reflective, sombre, and incapable of producing happiness simply by existing. Beyond fashion, mourning became a performance of morality. A woman who mourned correctly was virtuous. A woman who mourned incorrectly was heartless. Society measured a woman's grief by the fidelity of her wardrobe, not the depth of her pain. Which is a remarkable amount of pressure for someone already grieving the loss of a loved one. The truly strange part is how passionately Victorians embraced this ritual. Entire industries existed solely to outfit the grieving. Mourning warehouses, mourners' boutiques, advice books, columns, and instructional diagrams helped women navigate the emotional labyrinth of crepe, lace, and sorrow-coded colour palettes. Grief became a consumer experience, tightly bound to fashion, propriety, and social judgment. Victorian mourning wasn't about emotional processing. It was about appearance, discipline, symbolism, and the constant pressure to grieve beautifully. If you think modern weddings are stressful, imagine attending one where the bride isn't allowed to show excitement, walk too quickly, speak too loudly, eat too much, laugh too freely, or display any trace of the personality her future husband may have vaguely appreciated. A Victorian wedding wasn't about love. It was about passing your personality into storage. Every movement, every breath, every eyelash flutter was choreographed according to a rulebook so strict it made military drill manuals look casual. Let's begin with the bride's overall existence, which was supposed to radiate purity, serenity, frailty, modesty, and the faint suggestion that she had never once had an original thought. A bride's behaviour needed to communicate one thing only: I am an angel temporarily visiting the mortal world. Too much confidence? Scandalous. Too much nervousness? Immature. Too much joy? Unladylike. The ideal Victorian bride hovered in a strange emotional middle ground between blissful and anaesthetised. Her walk was one of the most scrutinised parts of the ceremony. She had to move slowly, steadily and gracefully, but not too slowly, or people would think she was savouring the attention. A bride who walked with any hint of haste looked unvirtuously eager, as though she liked her fiancé too much, which was suspicious. Her steps needed to be perfectly symmetrical, quiet and small enough that she appeared restricted by moral virtue, not by her corset, though the corset did most of the work. And she absolutely could not look down at her feet, even though Victorian shoes were basically slippery torture devices designed to sabotage every sacred moment. Then came her posture, which had to achieve impossible goals. She needed to stand straight but not stiff, relaxed but not casual, elegant but not showy, still but not statue-like. If she shifted her weight too noticeably, critics whispered she lacked refinement. If she stood perfectly motionless, they whispered she was overly trained. The Victorian bride existed in a posture paradox where even breathing too visibly could damage her feminine mystique. Her face also had rules, perhaps the most contradictory ones. She had to look happy but not delighted. A wide smile was unthinkable. Teeth were dangerous territory in Victorian etiquette, and should ideally remain unseen at all times. A demure, soft, almost apologetic expression was encouraged. She needed to appear like she was experiencing joy filtered through 5 layers of restraint. Any emotional extremes, excitement, nerves, tears, were frowned upon. Tears especially were complicated. Too many tears meant she was distressed. Too few meant she lacked sensitivity, a single delicate tear gliding silently down the cheek. Perfect. That was the Oscar-winning performance Victorian society expected. Her speech was limited to polite, gentle replies. She couldn't express enthusiasm about the ceremony, the decorations, or, heaven forbid, her own wedding dress. She had to speak softly enough that her relatives had to lean forward, but loudly enough that the groom could hear her vow, preferably without knowing she was on the verge of fainting. Women were discouraged from saying anything humorous, clever, or opinionated. A bride making jokes was practically unthinkable. A bride making meaningful conversation? Dangerous. The wedding day wasn't a stage for her personality, it was a stage for her chastity. Her dress was its own labyrinth of rules. White became popular due to Queen Victoria herself, and the colour carried immense symbolic weight. It communicated purity, obedience, and an unmarked moral record, regardless of reality, because Victorian symbolism worked harder than Victorian logic. The dress had to be elaborate, but not flashy, expensive, but not flamboyant, modest, but still fashionable enough to impress guests. Sleeves needed to cover the arms. Bare arms were positively criminal. Necklines had to be high enough to protect modesty, but low enough to show the dress wasn't a repurposed nightgown. Lace was encouraged, but too much lace meant vanity. Flowers were required, but only if they didn't overshadow the bride's aura of delicate fragility. Then there was the veil, a garment that symbolized modesty, virginity, and the societal hope that the bride might remain silent and mysterious forever. Lifting the veil was a dramatic moment, but even then, the bride was expected to avoid meeting the groom's eyes too boldly. Direct eye contact was considered too forward. Soft downward glances were preferable, making it abundantly clear that she was entering marriage as a polite whisper, not a human being. During the ceremony itself, the bride's hands were equally strategic. They had to remain still, neatly clasped, lightly resting, or placed gently upon her bouquet. No fidgeting, no shifting, no adjusting anything. A woman visibly adjusting her clothing was considered uncouth, even if her corset was compressing her ribs like a medieval torture device. Her bouquet, too, carried rules. It had to be held at the correct height. Too low and she seemed sloppy. Too high and she looked panicked. Brides were advised to hold flowers as though carrying something holy but not heavy. The bouquet symbolised fertility, purity, modesty, and the desperate hope she wouldn't drop it in front of 100 judgmental relatives. Even after the ceremony, the bride wasn't allowed to relax. Her behaviour at the wedding breakfast, the Victorian version of a reception, continued the performance. She ate little, drank less, and smiled gently at everyone. She could not dance too energetically, laugh too loudly, or spend too much time speaking to any one male guest who wasn't her husband, lest a rumour be born. She had to thank everyone for attending, in a tone that suggested gratitude without ambition. A bride who engaged too enthusiastically in conversation was suspected of having too much personality, and a bride who remained too quiet was pitied as timid or dull. The entire wedding day was designed to transform a bride into a living symbol, an emblem of womanhood at its most domestically idealised. The unstated message was clear. Today you become a wife, so kindly set aside everything that made you an individual. A Victorian bride wasn't celebrated for who she was celebrated for how well she impersonated the societal fantasy of womanhood. If Victorian etiquette had a secret mission, it was this: prevent women from becoming too interesting at all costs. The era perfected the art of suppressing female curiosity so thoroughly it could have been patented. Hobbies, reading choices, conversation topics, even intellectual sparks were monitored like potential threats. If a Victorian woman had too many opinions, society treated her like she'd brought dynamite to the dinner table. Being interesting wasn't a compliment, it was a risk, a dangerous one. A Victorian woman's life was a long, delicate balancing act between demonstrating just enough intelligence to avoid looking empty-headed, but not so much intelligence that she appeared opinionated, independent, ambitious, humorous, or, the greatest horror, self-assured. The ideal Victorian woman existed in a polite vacuum, pleasant, attractive, quiet, and mildly aware of the world around her, but never so aware that she might start asking questions. Let's begin with hobbies, which came with invisible warning labels. Women were allowed hobbies that were gentle, decorative, and incapable of producing disruptive thoughts. Needlework was safe, watercolour painting was safe, flower arranging, safe. Collecting pressed flowers, safe. Anything involving quiet suffering or tiny scissors was considered feminine and appropriate. But the moment a woman expressed interest in something that required mental engagement, astronomy, politics, chemistry, philosophy, or even serious music theory, she crossed into dangerously stimulating territory. Victorians genuinely worried that too much intellectual activity could overheat a woman's brain, as though curiosity itself were a form of fever. Even safe hobbies came with limits. A woman who embroidered too much, idle; a woman who embroidered too cleverly, potentially subversive; a woman who read too often, suspicious; a woman who read the wrong material, practically anarchic. Which brings us to reading, the secret path to intellectual independence, and therefore the Victorian boogeyman. Women were encouraged to read, but only certain genres: moral novels, pious biographies, gentle poetry, and instructional texts that reminded them how to behave like decorative angels. Anything beyond that, especially scientific works, philosophy, political treatises, or radical essays, was considered inappropriate, overstimulating, or outright dangerous. Victorian doctors even warned that reading too much fiction could inflame the imagination and corrupt a woman's moral compass. Meanwhile, reading too much non-fiction might give her ideas, which was, of course, unacceptable. A woman wrestling with thoughts was nearly as scandalous as a woman running in public, and a woman reading something controversial that could trigger a moral crisis so intense the neighbours would feel the tremors. Some etiquette books explicitly advised women to avoid excessive familiarity with deep subjects. Translation: please do not understand anything too thoroughly. It ruins the aesthetic. Victorian society also had strong opinions about conversation topics. A woman had to stay within a narrow, suffocating set of permissible subjects. Weather, not dramatic weather. Polite compliments, not too clever. Charity projects, not too ambitious. And light domestic matters, not too practical. Her conversational contributions needed to be pleasant, unobtrusive, and devoid of the slightest whiff of conflict or originality. A woman sharing a bold opinion was viewed with the level of alarm typically reserved for spotting a wild animal in the parlour. Particularly witty woman was dangerous. Humour suggested confidence. Confidence suggested independence. And independence? Scandal. A woman who made people laugh too easily risked becoming forward. That marvellous Victorian insult that meant everything from too clever to uncontrolled to slightly enjoyable. Laughter, especially witty laughter, threatened the established order. Curiosity was perhaps the most tightly policed trait of all. Victorian women were expected to be curious only about socially sanctioned topics: interior design, sentimental literature, fashionable causes, genteel crafts. Curiosity about the wider world was unthinkable. Asking too many questions during a dinner party made you appear intrusive. Asking the wrong kinds of questions about laws, business, science, medicine, the economy, or the actual mechanics of the world was unladylike. Curiosity was the intellectual equivalent of running your fingers along the edge of a razor. Fascinating for a moment, shocking to everyone else. This suppression wasn't accidental, it was strategic. An interesting woman was unpredictable. She had opinions, desires, ambitions, and questions. She might challenge her husband. She might refuse to accept nonsense. She might connect dots society preferred to keep separate. Worst of all, she might develop expectations for her own life. Victorian society feared nothing more than a woman who thought she deserved more than ornamental status. So the rules worked tirelessly to keep her schooling limited, her books harmless, her hobbies trivial, her thoughts mild, and her conversation soft enough to evaporate before reaching anyone's conscience. The social pressuring was relentless. Women who displayed too much intellectual curiosity were labelled eccentric, blue stockings, unfeminine, or simply odd. Men avoided marrying such women unless they wanted a wife who asked questions, a baffling thought for most Victorians. Families discouraged daughters from pursuing their interests too deeply, warning them that clever girls often struggled socially, as though knowledge were a stain that ruined marital prospects. And yet many Victorian women quietly rebelled. Some read banned books in secret. Some pursued scientific knowledge disguised as hobbies. Some wrote under pen names. Some met in private salons to discuss ideas. Curiosity found cracks in the system the way plants push through stone. Small acts of intellectual defiance blooming in shadowed corners. But for the majority, life was a constant negotiation. Remain interesting enough to prove you weren't dull, but never so interesting that you triggered alarm bells. Women learned to hide their cleverness behind polite smiles, filter their curiosity through safe questions, and tuck their opinions away like contraband. Being interesting became a private activity, never a public one. Victorian etiquette didn't just police women's actions, it policed their minds. It taught them that mediocrity was safer than brilliance, that mildness was more valuable than insight, and that the world could only tolerate their existence if it was soft, quiet, and uncomplicated. But the irony, of course, is that Victorian women were interesting. They were creative, intelligent, observant, ambitious, curious, all the things society feared they might be. The rules didn't stop women from being interesting, they just forced them to hide it. Victorian motherhood was less raising a child and more auditioning for society while holding a baby. Every movement, every feeding choice, every stroll through the park became a referendum on a woman's worth. Victorian mums didn't raise children, they raised future judgment. Their lives were governed by an etiquette rulebook so punishing that even modern parenting blogs with their competitive sleep schedules and quinoa for toddlers warfare look gentle by comparison. The first expectation was perfection from day one, as though motherhood sprang fully formed from a woman's soul the moment she glanced at an infant. New mothers were expected to be serene, competent, instinctively graceful, and emotionally unshakable. Fear, unacceptable. Exhaustion, ungrateful. Pain, unladylike. Victorian culture loved the idea of maternal instinct, not because it believed women actually had natural wisdom, but because it relieved society of the burden of supporting them. If a woman struggled, it wasn't due to lack of help, it was due to lack of character. The contradictions began immediately. A new mother had to appear endlessly devoted to her child, but not too devoted, or she looked obsessive or sentimental. She needed to be competent at child rearing, but not so confident that she seemed unfeminine or independent. She had to adore motherhood, with soft, glowing enthusiasm, but never show the physical or emotional strain it caused. Victorian motherhood was a tightrope strung between two cliffs labelled cold and overly affectionate, and falling off either one invited gossip. One of the most scrutinised arenas of maternal behaviour was feeding etiquette. Feeding a baby was treated like a delicate ballet between moral symbolism, social expectations, and carefully concealed suffering. Breastfeeding, though natural and encouraged, came with 1,000 regulations. A woman was expected to breastfeed discreetly, silently, invisibly. She could not nurse in front of guests, male relatives, or even female friends unless they were very close. The act had to be concealed behind screens, drapery, or a modest shawl, the Victorian equivalent of vanishing into a privacy tent. But if she didn't breastfeed, she entered an entirely new storm of criticism. Hiring a wet nurse was acceptable for wealthier families, but it came with its own stigma. It suggested she lacked devotion, constitution, or maternal vigour. Social observers would nod politely, while secretly recalculating her moral value. A mother who delegated feeding risked being judged as vain, lazy, or tragically fragile. It wasn't enough to feed the baby. She had to feed the baby correctly, meaning whatever society believed was appropriate for her class and temperament. Even bottle feeding, though emerging as an option, required secrecy. Bottles themselves were suspicious, and too much reliance on artificial feeding was whispered about like an illness. Victorian society excelled at judging women for every choice while offering no safe choice at all. Beyond feeding, strict rules governed infant behaviour, or rather, a mother's responsibility to curate that behaviour. A Victorian child could cry, but only gently. Intense crying suggested the mother lacked skill, sensitivity, or discipline. If the child fussed in public, the mother was expected to soothe them instantly, using techniques that somehow accomplished comfort without appearing frazzled. A screaming child was less a child and more a public indictment of maternal competence. Then came daily routines, timed with militaristic precision. Babies were to be bathed, fed, walked, napped, exercised and mentally stimulated according to detailed schedules. A woman who deviated from these routines risked raising a child who lacked proper constitution, a vague and ominous term Victorians used to describe everything from resilience to personality. A mother's success was measured by her ability to maintain a household rhythm, so strict it made clockmakers proud. Perhaps the most absurd rule was how mothers were expected to behave during postpartum recovery, mainly by pretending it didn't exist. A Victorian mother could experience fatigue, hormonal chaos, the physical aftermath of childbirth, and emotional turmoil, but acknowledging any of that was inappropriate. She was supposed to resume social duties quickly, appearing composed and grateful, as though childbirth were a pleasant intermission rather than a life-altering medical event. Anything less was seen as weakness, and Victorian society found female weakness both contemptible and inevitable, a paradox that made women responsible for fixing the flaws society claimed they were born with. Social expectations extended well beyond infancy. Victorian mothers were held responsible for their children's future manners, morality, class identity, and emotional control. A badly behaved child wasn't judged for being a child. The mother was judged for failing to mould them into a small, obedient adult. Children who ran too fast were undisciplined. Children who asked too many questions were precocious. Children who looked too curious were overstimulated. Children who appeared shy were mishandled. No outcome spared the mother from critique. There were also strict rules about how much of her identity a mother was allowed to retain. Too much devotion to her own hobbies or interests meant she was neglectful. Too little meant she was dull. A Victorian mother's selfhood had to shrink just enough to avoid threatening her domestic role, but not so much that she looked pathetic. She had to be a well-maintained prop in the household, valued, but only in the way decorative furniture was valued, admired, static, and always in place. Public outings with children required the poise of a parade float. A mother strolling with her child in a pram had to move gracefully, without rushing, bending too much, or letting her child handle anything dirty. Children were to be displayed like delicate collectibles, adorable, quiet, and well-coordinated with the day's outfits. A child dropping a toy was mildly embarrassing. A child picking it up unassisted, absolutely scandalous. Victorian children were practically allergic to the ground, and mothers were expected to enforce that. Underlying every rule was the assumption that motherhood was not a personal experience but a public performance, where the goal wasn't the child's well-being, but the mother's ability to maintain the illusion of flawless domestic virtue. A Victorian mother carried the weight of her child's future behaviour, her household's moral standing and her own reputation, all while being denied support, autonomy, and often rest. And yet, despite these crushing expectations, Victorian mothers were resourceful. They developed networks of female friends who shared advice in quiet acts of rebellion. They sought moments of privacy whenever possible. Some even rejected strict rules behind closed doors, letting their children play, roam, explore, and be messy human beings in ways society would never approve. Victorian motherhood was an impossible job wrapped in lace, sentimentality, and relentless scrutiny, a testament not to women's fragility, as society claimed, but to their extraordinary resilience. After surviving through chapters of Victorian etiquette, a labyrinth of rules so specific, so illogical, and so wildly invasive they could make even modern bureaucracy blush, the natural question is, why? Why did an entire society dedicate itself to micromanaging women with the enthusiasm of a Victorian hall monitor hopped up on caffeine? Why all the rules about legs, smiles, gloves, voices, opinions, pockets, parasols, posture, weddings, motherhood, and the correct emotional temperature of a handwritten letter? It turns out these rules didn't come from nowhere. They came from a messy cocktail of cultural anxiety, rigid class hierarchies, legal oppression, and moral panic, all neatly dressed in lace, dipped in lavender water, and sold as proper womanhood. Victorian etiquette walked so modern sexism could jog right into a wall. Let's start with the biggest layer. Victorian society was terrified of change. Industrialisation was transforming everything: families, cities, jobs, morals, and even the pace of life. Trains were suddenly flying across the countryside like iron monsters. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than humans could process. Science began debunking long-held beliefs. Literacy surged. Cities exploded. And the world, for the first time, moved faster than anyone's ability to understand it. When society feels out of control, it clings tightly to whatever it can control. In the Victorian era, that meant women. Women became the anchor, that supposedly kept society moral, pure, and stable. Men went into the chaotic world of factories, politics, business, and public life. Women, in contrast, were expected to be quiet, gentle, controlled, and contained. The moral wallpaper holding the home together, while the world outside reinvented itself daily. This wasn't about protecting women. It was about using them as symbols to soothe cultural panic. Layer 2. The legal system treated women as property, and etiquette helped disguise that uncomfortable fact with lace and niceness. A married woman couldn't own property, vote, manage her own wages, enter contracts, or defend herself legally without her husband's approval. So if the law insisted women had no autonomy, etiquette had to create an elaborate fantasy where women didn't need autonomy, because they were too delicate, too pure, too fragile, too moral to deal with the real world. Etiquette wasn't about manners, it was a performance of powerlessness. That's why so many rules forced women into shrinking small steps, soft voices, tiny bites, restricted curiosity, shallow breaths, narrow skin on sleeves and non-existent pockets. A woman with no pockets can't carry money. A woman who can't walk fast can't travel alone. A woman who can't speak loudly can't challenge authority. A woman who needs a chaperone for everything can't act independently. It wasn't accidental, it was structural. Layer 3, Victorian class obsession. The middle and upper classes were desperate to separate themselves from everyone beneath them. Etiquette became a competitive art form, a way to display refinement, morality, and distance from labour. The stricter the rule, the more elite it felt. Working-class women couldn't afford to obey half of these standards. They had jobs, responsibilities, and actual lives. So society labelled them improper, using etiquette as a velvet-gloved tool of exclusion. A lady didn't run, didn't shout, didn't eat like she needed the calories, didn't show frustration, didn't show desire, didn't show breath. Because real emotion, real movement, real hunger, real bodily functions were associated with work, the outdoors, and, horror of horrors, ordinary people. These rules weren't random, they were class, cosplay. Layer 4. Victorian morality was deeply intertwined with fear of female sexuality. Most etiquette wasn't about politeness, it was about control. Women showing ankles, dangerous. Women walking too fast, suggestive. Women giving gifts, romantic implication. Women reading too widely, intellectual temptation. Women speaking too loudly, social rebellion. Women smiling too broadly, emotional transparency. Nearly every behaviour was sexualised by implication. If a woman could do something freely, she might also choose her own relationships freely. And Victorian society preferred marriages based on financial alliances, family arrangements, and rigid hierarchy, not personal choice. Etiquette kept women from appearing too autonomous, too attractive, or too capable, because capable women don't wait around for permission. Layer 5. Religious ideology played its part too. Many Victorians believed women were naturally purer, morally superior beings whose job was to civilise men. But purity came with a price: silence, sacrifice, and self-erasure. Women had to be the moral backbone of society, but in the most physically restricted way possible. They were praised as angels while being treated like fragile figurines. And here's the real irony: these rules hardly protected women at all. In fact, they exposed them to enormous vulnerability. Women weren't taught practical skills, weren't allowed financial independence, weren't permitted legal autonomy, and weren't encouraged to build emotional resilience, all because etiquette demanded they live as controlled decorative beings, rather than functional adults. The Victorian ideal woman wasn't an empowered person. She was a porcelain myth propped on a pedestal and told not to breathe too deeply. So why do these rules make no sense today? Because we no longer live in a world where women are legally owned, socially confined, or culturally framed as moral shock absorbers. We no longer pretend that femininity equals fragility, or that manners should replace autonomy. We no longer panic at the sight of a woman's ungloved hand or assume curiosity as a symptom of rebellion.